You are not tired from your day. You are tired from carrying a war inside your mind that nobody else can see. A war against things that haven't happened, against people who may never change, against a future you've already lived 100 times inside your own head, and none of those versions ended well. You wake up tired. You go to sleep with a heavy chest. And somewhere between the morning alarm and the midnight silence, you wonder how it became this way. How your mind became a place you were afraid to be alone in. The Buddha had a word for this. He called it the second arrow. Life strikes you with the first unavoidable, sharp, real. But the second arrow? You fire that one yourself. Every time you replay the past. Every time you rehearse the worst. Every time you refuse to put down what is already done, already gone, already beyond your reach. You have been living with that arrow inside you for so long, you forgot it wasn't always there. Today, we pull it out. 1. Worry is a story the mind tells itself about a future that may never come. Worry often feels serious and real, but when you examine it closely, you begin to notice that it is usually a story the mind is creating about the future. The mind imagines situations that have not happened yet and treats them as if they are already real. A person might spend hours worrying about a conversation that might go badly, about a problem that might appear tomorrow, or about a situation that might never occur at all. The Buddha taught that the mind has a powerful tendency to create suffering through imagination. When we believe every fearful story the mind creates, we begin to live inside problems that do not exist yet. But when you become aware of this habit, you start to observe worry differently. Instead of automatically believing every anxious thought, you begin to recognize that the mind is simply predicting possibilities. The moment you see worry as a mental story rather than a guaranteed reality, its power begins to fade and your mind starts to regain its balance. 2. Worry pulls you away from the only moment that exists. One of the biggest problems with worry is that it slowly pulls your mind away from the present moment, which is the only place where life is actually happening. When the mind starts worrying, it begins traveling into the future, imagining situations that have not happened yet. Instead of experiencing what is in front of you, your attention becomes trapped in thoughts about what might go wrong tomorrow, next week, or even years from now. Because of this, many people spend their days physically present in one place, while their minds are somewhere else entirely. For example, a person may be sitting with family during dinner, yet instead of enjoying the moment, their mind is worrying about work problems or future responsibilities. Someone else may be walking outside on a calm and beautiful day, but instead of noticing the fresh air, the sunlight, or the peaceful surroundings, their mind is busy creating fears about what could go wrong in the future. In this way, worry quietly steals the richness of the present moment without people even realizing it. Buddhism teaches that peace can only be found in the present moment because the past has already passed and the future has not arrived yet. Worry tries to convince the mind that thinking about the future will solve problems, but most of the time, it only creates more stress. When you gently bring your attention back to what is happening right now, something begins to change inside you. Your breathing slows down, your thoughts become clearer, and the mind starts to relax. Simple awareness can be very powerful. Paying attention to your breath, noticing the sounds around you, or simply observing the moment without judgment can gradually calm the mind. When your attention returns to the present, worry begins to lose its grip, and you start experiencing life as it truly is, instead of living inside imagined problems. 3. Life has always been uncertain. Many worries are created by the human desire to control everything that might happen in life. People naturally want certainty. They want to know that their plans will succeed, that their relationships will remain stable, and that the future will unfold exactly as they expect. When things feel uncertain, the mind often reacts with worry because it tries to predict every possible outcome in order to feel safe. However, The truth is that life has always been uncertain. No person can fully control what tomorrow will bring. Situations change, people change, and unexpected events appear in everyone's life at some point. The Buddha taught that much of our stress comes from resisting this reality. When the mind demands guarantees from a world that constantly changes, worry becomes almost unavoidable. Instead of trying to control everything, Buddhism encourages a different approach. It teaches us to accept that uncertainty is a natural part of life. When you begin to accept that not everything can be predicted or controlled, the mind slowly becomes more flexible and calm. You start focusing on what you can do in the present moment rather than exhausting yourself by imagining endless possibilities. This shift in perspective brings a surprising sense of freedom. You realize that worrying about every possible outcome does not actually protect you from problems. It only drains your mental energy. When you accept uncertainty with wisdom and patience, life begins to feel lighter, and the mind becomes more peaceful, even in situations that are not fully predictable. 4. Not every thought deserves your attention. The human mind produces an endless stream of thoughts throughout the day. Some of these thoughts are useful because they help us solve problems, make decisions, or understand situations more clearly, but many thoughts appear automatically without any real value. Among these automatic thoughts, worrying thoughts are some of the most common. They often appear suddenly and try to convince you that something bad might happen, that you will fail, or that a situation will turn out worse than expected. If you automatically believe every one of these thoughts, the mind quickly becomes overwhelmed with fear and anxiety. The Buddha taught that one of the most important skills a person can develop is the ability to observe their thoughts rather than immediately believing them. Most people assume that if a thought appears in the mind, it must be important or true. But in reality, the mind is constantly reacting to memories, emotions, past experiences, and imagination. Because of this, not every thought that appears deserves your attention or your emotional energy. For example, you might suddenly think that someone dislikes you, even though you have no real evidence. Or your mind might tell you that something will go wrong tomorrow, even though the situation has not even happened yet. If you immediately believe these thoughts, they begin to grow stronger and create more stress inside your mind. But if you pause and simply observe the thought, you begin to see it differently. Instead of reacting to it, you can quietly acknowledge it and let it pass. Buddhism often compares thoughts to clouds moving across the sky. Clouds appear, move, and eventually disappear. In the same way, thoughts rise in the mind and then fade away if we do not cling to them. The problem begins when we grab onto these thoughts and treat them as permanent truths. This attachment is what gives worry its power. When you start practicing awareness, you slowly learn that you do not have to follow every thought that appears. You can choose which thoughts deserve your attention and which ones can simply pass by. This small shift creates a powerful change in your inner life. Instead of being controlled by every worrying idea, you become the observer of your mind. Over time, this awareness makes the mind calmer and more stable. You begin to notice that many worrying thoughts are only temporary mental reactions. They do not define reality, and they do not need to control your peace. The more you practice observing your thoughts with patience and understanding, the less power those thoughts have over your emotions. By realizing that not every thought deserves your attention, you begin to free your mind from unnecessary worry. Instead of being carried away by every anxious idea, you remain grounded, calm, and present. This ability to observe the mind without being controlled by it is one of the most powerful forms of inner freedom taught in Buddhism. 5. Letting go requires inner strength. Many people believe that worrying shows responsibility. They think that if they keep thinking about a problem again and again, they are somehow preparing themselves for the future. The mind tells them that worrying means they care, and that letting go means being careless. Because of this belief, people hold on to worries even when those worries are slowly exhausting their minds. However, the Buddha taught that constantly carrying unnecessary worries is not a sign of wisdom. In many cases, it is simply a habit the mind has learned over time. Letting go of worry actually requires a deeper kind of strength. It requires the courage to accept that not everything in life can be controlled. The mind naturally tries to protect itself by imagining every possible danger or problem that could happen in the future. But this habit rarely creates real solutions. Instead, it creates tension, anxiety, and endless mental noise. When a person learns to release unnecessary worry, they are not ignoring life's challenges. They are simply choosing not to waste their energy on things that cannot be changed or predicted. True strength appears when a person begins to understand the difference between action and worry. Action means doing what you can in the present moment to improve a situation. Worry, on the other hand, often means repeating the same fearful thoughts without taking any meaningful step forward. Many people spend hours worrying about problems instead of calmly focusing on what they can actually do. The Buddha encouraged people to develop clarity in this area. If something can be solved through action, then take action. If it cannot be controlled, then worrying about it will only disturb the mind. Letting go also requires trust in the natural flow of life. Life has always moved through change, uncertainty, and unexpected events. Trying to control every detail only creates frustration because reality rarely follows our exact expectations. When a person learns to loosen their grip on constant control, their mind becomes more flexible and peaceful. Instead of fighting every situation mentally, they begin to respond with patience and understanding. Another important part of letting go is learning to release the emotional weight attached to situations. Many worries continue because people hold on to fears, past experiences, or imagined outcomes. The mind keeps replaying the same thoughts as if repeating them will somehow prevent future problems. But this repetition usually keeps the mind trapped in a cycle of stress. When you slowly begin to release these attachments, your mental space becomes clearer. This process does not happen instantly. Letting go is a skill that develops with awareness and practice. Each time you notice a worry that you cannot control and gently allow it to pass, you strengthen your ability to remain calm. Over time, this habit creates a quieter and more stable mind. The Buddha often emphasized that peace does not come from eliminating every challenge in life. Challenges will always appear. Peace comes from how the mind responds to those challenges. When you stop feeding unnecessary worries and begin focusing your energy on what truly matters, life begins to feel lighter. Letting go is not weakness. It is a form of wisdom. It is the understanding that your mental energy is valuable and should not be spent on fears that bring no real solution. When you practice letting go, you begin to move through life with greater clarity, patience, and inner strength. The mind becomes less burdened, and peace becomes easier to maintain even when life is uncertain. 6. Peace comes from simplicity. In the modern world, many people believe that life must be complicated in order to be successful or meaningful. They fill their days with endless plans, responsibilities, comparisons, and expectations. The mind becomes busy thinking about what needs to be done tomorrow, what could go wrong next week, and how their life compares with the lives of others. Over time, this constant mental activity creates pressure that slowly removes the natural calmness of the mind. A person may appear busy and productive on the outside, yet inside their thoughts feel chaotic and heavy. The Buddha often pointed out that much of this suffering is not created by life itself, but by the unnecessary complexity that the human mind creates. Simplicity is one of the most powerful ways to bring peace back into life. When life becomes simpler, the mind also becomes quieter. Instead of constantly chasing more, worrying more, and comparing more, a person begins to focus on what truly matters. Buddhism teaches that peace does not come from controlling every detail of life, but from reducing the unnecessary noise that fills the mind. When the mind is constantly overloaded with worries, expectations, and distractions, it becomes difficult to feel calm, even in peaceful environments. But when a person begins to simplify their thoughts, priorities, and lifestyle, the mind slowly returns to a more natural state of balance. One of the biggest sources of mental complexity is comparison. In today's world, people are constantly measuring their lives against the lives of others. They worry about whether they are successful enough, wealthy enough, admired enough, or progressing fast enough. This habit creates endless dissatisfaction because there will always be someone who appears to have more or achieve more. The Buddha explained that comparison traps the mind in a cycle of desire and frustration. Instead of appreciating the life in front of them, people begin chasing an image of how life should look. When a person learns to step away from constant comparison, something peaceful begins to happen. They start focusing on their own path instead of constantly judging themselves against others. Another source of unnecessary complexity comes from expectations. Many worries are created because people expect life to unfold in a very specific way. They expect certain plans to succeed, certain relationships to remain stable, and certain outcomes to appear exactly as imagined. When reality moves in a different direction, the mind reacts with frustration and worry. The Buddha taught that attachment to rigid expectations often creates suffering because life is constantly changing. When a person begins to loosen these expectations, they become more flexible and accepting of life's natural flow. Instead of resisting every unexpected situation, they learn to respond with patience and understanding. Simplicity also means learning to focus on the present moment instead of constantly filling the mind with future concerns. Many people live almost entirely in their thoughts about what might happen later. They plan every possible scenario and worry about outcomes that are far away. This habit slowly disconnects them from the richness of everyday life. Simple moments such as a quiet walk, a conversation with a loved one, or a peaceful evening become overlooked because the mind is always busy somewhere else. When life becomes simpler, these ordinary moments begin to regain their meaning. A person begins to notice the small details of life that were previously hidden beneath layers of worry. The Buddha often encouraged people to slow down and observe the nature of their experience. When the mind becomes quiet enough, a person begins to see that happiness does not always come from achieving more or accumulating more. Instead, it often appears naturally when the mind is free from constant tension. Simplicity allows the mind to rest. It creates space for clarity, gratitude, and calmness to appear. Another important part of simplicity is learning to reduce mental noise. The mind constantly produces opinions, judgments, fears, and imaginary scenarios. Many people assume that they must respond to every thought that appears. But Buddhism teaches that peace begins when we stop giving attention to every passing thought. When the mind is not constantly reacting, it becomes quieter and more stable. This quietness allows a person to think more clearly and respond to situations with greater wisdom. Simplicity also changes the way a person approaches daily life. Instead of trying to do everything at once, they begin focusing on one task at a time. Instead of rushing through the day with constant urgency, they move through activities with greater awareness. Even simple actions like breathing, walking, eating, or listening become more meaningful when they are done with full attention. This mindful way of living creates a deeper sense of calm because the mind is no longer scattered across dozens of worries and distractions. Many people fear simplicity because they associate it with giving up ambition or progress. But simplicity does not mean abandoning goals or responsibilities. It means removing unnecessary mental weight while continuing to move forward in life. A simple mind can still be productive, creative, and focused. In fact, when the mind is not overwhelmed by worry, it often becomes more effective and clearer in decision-making. The Buddha emphasized that peace is not something that must be chased endlessly. It is something that naturally appears when the mind stops creating unnecessary complications. Much of human stress is created by trying to control too much, expect too much, and think too much. When a person gradually releases these habits, they begin to experience life with greater ease. As simplicity grows, the mind becomes more stable and balanced. Small problems no longer feel overwhelming because the mind is not already overloaded with worry. A person becomes better able to respond calmly to challenges because their thoughts are clearer. Life begins to feel less like a constant struggle and more like a natural flow of experiences. Over time, this simple approach to life creates a deeper kind of happiness. It is not the temporary excitement that comes from external achievements, but a steady sense of inner calm. The mind becomes less reactive, more patient, and more peaceful. Even when difficulties appear, they no longer shake the mind as strongly as before. In this way, simplicity becomes a powerful path to peace. When the mind is no longer crowded with endless worries and expectations, life begins to feel lighter. The present moment becomes richer, relationships become more meaningful, and everyday experiences regain their quiet beauty. The Buddha's teachings remind us that sometimes the greatest transformation does not come from adding more to life, but from gently letting go of the unnecessary burdens that the mind has been carrying for far too long. 7. Life is too short to spend it worrying. One of the deepest realizations a person can have is understanding how short and fragile life truly is. Most people move through their days believing they have endless time ahead of them. Because of this illusion, they allow their minds to become filled with worries, stress, and unnecessary fears. They worry about what others think, they worry about mistakes from the past, and they worry endlessly about a future that has not even arrived yet. Yet when you step back and observe life honestly, you begin to see that time moves forward quietly and quickly. Days become weeks, weeks become years, and before a person fully realizes it, large portions of life have already passed. The Buddha often reminded people to reflect on the impermanent nature of life. Everything in this world changes. Situations change, relationships change, and even the strongest emotions eventually pass. Nothing remains exactly the same forever. When people forget this truth, they begin to treat their worries as if they are permanent and extremely important. But when a person truly understands impermanence, their perspective begins to change. They start to realize that many of the things they spend their energy worrying about will not even matter in a few months or a few years. Think about how many worries people carry every day. A person may spend hours worrying about whether someone likes them or not. Another person may worry constantly about how others judge their choices or their appearance. Someone else may worry about mistakes they made years ago, replaying the same memory again and again in their mind. All of this mental energy is spent on thoughts that cannot change the past and cannot fully control the future. While the mind is trapped inside these worries, life continues moving forward quietly. This is why the Buddha encouraged people to develop awareness of how precious each moment truly is. When you realize that life is limited, your priorities begin to shift. Suddenly, many of the things that once felt extremely important begin to lose their significance. The opinions of others become less powerful. Small problems become easier to release. Instead of holding on to every worry, the mind begins to ask a very important question. Is this really worth the limited time and energy I have in this life? Most of the time, the honest answer is no. Many worries are simply habits the mind has developed over years of thinking in the same patterns. The mind believes that worrying will somehow prevent problems or protect us from disappointment, but in reality, worry rarely prevents anything. It only steals the peace that could have been experienced in the present moment. When a person begins to understand this deeply, they start learning how to let go of unnecessary mental burdens. This does not mean ignoring responsibilities or pretending that problems do not exist. Life will always include challenges, decisions, and difficult situations. But there is a big difference between facing life with clarity and being trapped in endless worry. A clear mind can respond to problems calmly and wisely, while a worried mind often becomes overwhelmed and confused. Another important realization is that worry often prevents people from appreciating the simple beauty of everyday life. Many moments of peace pass by unnoticed because the mind is busy thinking about something else. A quiet morning, a calm conversation, a walk in fresh air, or even a moment of silence can bring deep peace if the mind is present. But when worry dominates the mind, these simple experiences are overlooked. Buddhism teaches that happiness is often found in the small moments that people usually ignore. When the mind becomes less distracted by worry, these moments begin to stand out more clearly. You start noticing the warmth of sunlight, the comfort of stillness, the sound of nature, and the presence of the people around you. Life begins to feel richer, not because circumstances have changed, but because your attention is no longer trapped in endless future fears. Understanding the shortness of life also changes the way we treat other people. When we remember that everyone is moving through their own struggles and that time is limited for all of us, anger and resentment begin to lose their grip. Many arguments and conflicts that once felt extremely important suddenly appear small. The mind becomes more patient, more forgiving, and more compassionate. The Buddha taught that wisdom grows when we reflect on the temporary nature of everything. Every emotion, every situation, and every difficulty eventually passes. Even the hardest moments in life slowly transform with time. When a person truly understands this, they become less afraid of temporary problems because they know that nothing remains the same forever. Instead of being controlled by worry, a wise person begins focusing their attention on living with awareness. They focus on the actions they can take today rather than endlessly imagining tomorrow. They focus on cultivating calmness, kindness, and clarity in their daily life. These qualities bring a deeper sense of stability that worry can never provide. Over time, this shift creates a powerful transformation in the way life is experienced. The mind becomes lighter because it is no longer carrying unnecessary fears. Situations that once caused intense stress become easier to handle because the mind is more balanced. Instead of reacting with panic, a person learns to respond with patience. Life itself does not suddenly become perfect. Challenges still appear, and unexpected events still happen. But the difference is in how the mind approaches these situations. A mind that is not constantly weighed down by worry has more strength to face reality as it is. Eventually, a person begins to realize something very important. Peace was never hidden somewhere far away in the future. It was always available in the present moment, waiting for the mind to stop chasing endless worries. When you stop feeding unnecessary fears, your mind becomes quieter. When your mind becomes quieter, you begin to see life more clearly. And when you see life more clearly, you start to appreciate how precious every moment truly is. Life is too short to spend it carrying worries that do not serve you. Time continues moving forward, whether the mind is peaceful or anxious. But when you choose to release unnecessary worry, each moment becomes lighter, calmer, and more meaningful. This is one of the most powerful insights in Buddhist wisdom. The freedom you are searching for is not found by controlling every outcome or predicting every possible future. It is found in learning how to live fully in the present moment without allowing endless worry to steal the life that is happening right now. 8. The mind becomes peaceful when you stop fighting life. One of the deepest reasons people experience constant worry is because they are quietly fighting against life itself. The mind creates an image of how life should unfold, how people should behave, and how situations should develop. When reality does not match those expectations, the mind begins resisting what is happening. It questions why things are not going according to plan and starts imagining different outcomes that could have been better. This resistance slowly creates tension inside the mind, and that tension often appears as worry. The Buddha taught that much of human suffering comes from this habit of resisting reality. The mind constantly tries to control events, predict outcomes, and arrange life in a way that guarantees comfort and certainty. But life rarely follows a perfectly controlled path. Situations change unexpectedly, people act in ways we do not expect, and plans sometimes move in completely different directions. When the mind keeps fighting these natural changes, it becomes exhausted and restless. Many people do not realize how much energy they spend mentally arguing with reality. A person may think about a mistake that already happened and repeatedly wish it had been different. Another person may worry endlessly about a situation they cannot control, hoping their thoughts will somehow influence the outcome. Others become frustrated when life moves slower than they expected, or when certain goals take longer to achieve. All of these reactions come from the same root: the mind's refusal to accept life as it is unfolding. The problem is that this constant resistance does not change reality. It only creates stress inside the mind. Worry often grows from the gap between what is happening and what the mind wishes would happen instead. The larger that gap becomes, the stronger the worry becomes. Buddhism offers a different approach to life. Instead of constantly resisting reality, the Buddha encouraged people to develop acceptance and understanding. Acceptance does not mean giving up or becoming passive. It means recognizing the present moment exactly as it is, without immediately fighting it in your thoughts. When the mind stops arguing with reality, a surprising sense of calm begins to appear. For example, imagine that a situation in your life does not go as planned. The mind may immediately begin worrying about the consequences and replaying the situation again and again. It may imagine worst-case scenarios and criticize itself for what went wrong. This mental struggle can continue for hours or even days. But when a person practices acceptance, the first step is simply acknowledging the reality of the moment. Instead of fighting the situation mentally, they observe it calmly and ask themselves what can be done next. This shift from resistance to awareness changes the entire experience of the mind. When you stop trying to mentally control every outcome, your thoughts become quieter. The mind becomes more flexible because it is no longer trapped in a rigid expectation of how things must be. The Buddha often compared life to a flowing river. The river moves continuously, sometimes calm and sometimes turbulent. If a person tries to stop the river or force it to move in a different direction, they will only exhaust themselves. But if they learn to move with the current instead of fighting it, their journey becomes much smoother. In the same way, when the mind stops resisting every change in life, it becomes easier to navigate challenges with patience and clarity. Another important aspect of letting go of resistance is understanding that control has limits. Humans naturally want to control outcomes because it creates a sense of safety. But the truth is that many aspects of life exist beyond our control. We cannot control every event, every decision made by others, or every change that occurs around us. The Buddha taught that peace appears when we focus our energy on what we can influence while learning to release what we cannot. When a person constantly worries about things outside their control, the mind becomes trapped in frustration. But when they begin to recognize these limits, they can redirect their attention toward meaningful action instead of endless mental struggle. This shift frees the mind from unnecessary stress and allows a person to respond more wisely to the situations that truly require attention. Acceptance also transforms the way people experience uncertainty. Much worry comes from fear of what might happen in the future. The mind tries to predict every possible outcome so that it can feel prepared. But the future is always uncertain, and no amount of worrying can remove that uncertainty. When the mind learns to accept uncertainty as a natural part of life, worry begins to lose its intensity. Instead of trying to control every future possibility, a person learns to trust their ability to handle situations as they arise. This creates a deeper form of confidence. It is not the confidence that comes from knowing exactly what will happen, but the confidence that comes from trusting your own ability to face whatever life brings. Another transformation that occurs when the mind stops fighting life is a greater sense of patience. Many worries are connected to impatience. People want results quickly, solutions immediately, and progress without delay. When things move slower than expected, the mind becomes restless and anxious. But when patience grows, the mind becomes more comfortable with the natural rhythm of life. Patience allows the mind to remain steady, even when answers are not immediately clear. It teaches a person to observe situations carefully rather than reacting impulsively. This calm observation often leads to wiser decisions and more thoughtful responses. The Buddha also taught that acceptance allows people to experience life more fully. When the mind is constantly resisting reality, it remains trapped inside its own thoughts. But when resistance fades, awareness becomes clearer. A person begins to notice the present moment more deeply. They see situations more honestly, without the distortion created by fear or expectation. Over time, this practice creates a profound inner stability. Worry begins to lose its hold because the mind is no longer fighting every situation that appears. Challenges still occur, but they are approached with calmness rather than panic. Eventually, a person begins to realize something very important. Life itself was never the true source of their suffering. Much of the stress they experienced came from the way the mind reacted to life's changes. When those reactions soften and acceptance grows stronger, the mind naturally becomes more peaceful. This does not mean that life suddenly becomes easy or that problems disappear completely. Difficult moments will still arise and unexpected situations will still occur. But the difference lies in the mind's response. A mind that has learned to stop fighting life is far more capable of moving through difficulties with balance and clarity. In this way, letting go of resistance becomes one of the most powerful ways to release worry. The mind becomes lighter because it is no longer carrying the heavy burden of trying to control everything. Life continues to flow, just as it always has, but now the mind moves with it rather than against it. And in that movement, a quiet and lasting peace begins to appear. 9. Freedom begins the moment you stop feeding your worries. One of the most powerful realizations a person can have is understanding that worry survives only when we continue feeding it with our attention. Many people believe that worry appears suddenly and controls their mind without permission. But in reality, worry usually grows because the mind keeps returning to the same fearful thoughts again and again. Each time the mind repeats a worry, it gives that thought more strength. Over time, the thought begins to feel heavier and more real, even though it may still be nothing more than a possibility in the imagination. The Buddha taught that the mind becomes shaped by what it repeatedly focuses on. If the mind constantly returns to fear, doubt, and anxiety, those patterns slowly become stronger. But if the mind learns to redirect its attention toward awareness and calmness, those peaceful states also grow stronger. This simple understanding reveals an important truth. Worry often becomes powerful not because the situation is overwhelming, but because the mind keeps feeding the same anxious thought over and over again. Think about how worry usually develops. A small thought appears in the mind about something that might go wrong. Instead of simply noticing the thought and letting it pass, the mind begins examining it. It starts imagining different scenarios, predicting possible problems, and replaying the thought repeatedly. Each repetition strengthens the feeling of fear. Soon, the mind becomes trapped in a cycle where the same thought keeps returning with greater intensity. This process often happens so automatically that people believe they have no control over it. But Buddhism teaches that awareness can interrupt this cycle. The moment you recognize that the mind is repeating a worrying thought, you gain the opportunity to respond differently. Instead of continuing the cycle of fear, you can gently shift your attention to something more stable, such as your breathing or the present moment. Breaking the habit of feeding worry does not mean forcing the mind to become completely silent. The mind naturally produces thoughts, and some worries will still appear from time to time. What changes is your relationship with those thoughts. Instead of immediately engaging with them and expanding them into long mental stories, you learn to observe them without becoming trapped inside them. Imagine a small spark landing on dry grass. If nothing touches it, the spark quickly fades. But if wind and fuel continue feeding the spark, it can grow into a large fire. Worry works in a similar way. A small thought may appear in the mind, but it becomes a powerful source of anxiety only when the mind keeps adding fuel to it through repeated attention. The Buddha encouraged people to practice mindfulness as a way to see this process clearly. Mindfulness means observing your thoughts and emotions with calm awareness rather than reacting automatically. When you watch your thoughts carefully, you begin to notice how quickly the mind tries to expand a simple worry into a complicated story about the future. For example, a person may suddenly think about a mistake they made at work. Within seconds, the mind may begin imagining negative outcomes, such as losing their job or disappointing others. The mind may continue building this chain of fears until the person feels overwhelmed. Yet the original thought was simply a small memory. The suffering was created by the mind repeatedly feeding the story. When mindfulness is present, a different response becomes possible. Instead of continuing the chain of worries, the person notices the thought and recognizes it as simply a mental event. They may acknowledge the thought without judgment and allow it to pass naturally. This small act of awareness prevents the mind from adding more fuel to the worry. Over time, this practice weakens the habit of anxious thinking. The mind gradually learns that it does not need to follow every fearful thought. Just as waves rise and fall on the surface of the ocean, thoughts also rise and fall within the mind. When you stop feeding them with constant attention, they naturally lose their strength. Another important part of this process is understanding that attention is one of the most valuable resources the mind possesses. Whatever you repeatedly focus on grows stronger in your mental experience. If your attention constantly returns to problems, your mind begins to feel surrounded by problems. But when attention begins focusing on awareness, gratitude, and present moment experience, the mind begins to feel calmer and more balanced. This does not mean ignoring real challenges in life. When a situation requires action, it is wise to address it with clarity and effort. But there is a big difference between solving a problem and mentally replaying it hundreds of times without taking meaningful action. Worry often traps people in endless thinking that does not lead to solutions. By learning to stop feeding these cycles of thought, a person begins to experience a new kind of freedom. The mind becomes less reactive and more stable. Situations that once caused intense anxiety begin to feel more manageable because the mind is no longer amplifying them through constant mental repetition. The Buddha often emphasized that freedom from suffering begins inside the mind itself. External circumstances may change, but the habits of thought we carry inside us often shape our experience far more strongly. When the mind learns to release its attachment to repetitive worries, a deep sense of calm begins to appear. At first, this change may feel subtle. A person might simply notice that their mind becomes quiet more quickly after a worrying thought appears. Over time, these moments of calm grow longer and more frequent. The mind becomes less interested in returning to anxious patterns because it begins to recognize that those patterns bring unnecessary suffering. Eventually, a person begins to understand that they are not powerless against their worries. They have the ability to choose where their attention goes. This realization creates a powerful shift in perspective. Instead of feeling controlled by every anxious thought, a person becomes aware that they can gently redirect their focus whenever worry begins to grow. This ability does not eliminate every difficulty in life, but it transforms how those difficulties are experienced. When the mind stops feeding endless fears about the future, the present moment becomes clearer and easier to navigate. Decisions become calmer, actions become more thoughtful, and emotions become more balanced. In this way, the path to freedom is not about eliminating every worrying thought that appears. It is about learning not to give those thoughts the constant attention they need to grow. When the mind stops feeding worry with endless repetition, the space for peace naturally expands. The Buddha's teachings remind us that the mind is like a garden. Whatever seeds receive the most attention will grow the strongest. If worry is constantly watered with attention and fear, it will spread quickly. But if awareness, patience, and calm understanding receive that attention instead, the garden of the mind begins to change. As this change continues, worry loses its ability to dominate the mind. Thoughts still appear, but they pass more easily without leaving deep marks. The mind becomes lighter, clearer, and more peaceful. And in that quiet clarity, a person finally begins to experience the freedom that comes from no longer feeding the worries that once controlled their life. 10. A calm mind sees life more clearly. When the mind is constantly filled with worry, it becomes difficult to see life clearly. Worry clouds the mind in the same way that thick fog covers a landscape. When fog fills the air, even familiar places become confusing and difficult to navigate. In the same way, when worry fills the mind, simple situations can feel overwhelming, and small problems can appear much larger than they truly are. The Buddha often taught that clarity of mind is one of the greatest forms of wisdom, because a calm mind is able to understand reality as it truly is. Many people live with a mind that is constantly restless. Their thoughts move quickly from one worry to another, jumping between past mistakes and imagined future problems. Because of this constant movement, they rarely experience true mental stillness. The mind becomes so busy reacting to thoughts that it never has the opportunity to settle into a peaceful state. Over time, this restlessness begins to affect the way a person sees the world. Situations appear more threatening, decisions feel more stressful, and even ordinary challenges seem heavier than they actually are. The Buddha explained that the quality of the mind strongly influences how we experience life. If the mind is anxious and agitated, the world begins to appear chaotic and overwhelming. But if the mind becomes calm and balanced, the same world begins to look very different. Situations that once seemed frightening become easier to understand. Problems that once felt impossible to solve become manageable. The external world may not have changed, but the mind observing it has become clearer. A calm mind does not mean the absence of thoughts. Thoughts will always appear because thinking is a natural function of the mind. What changes is the way those thoughts are experienced. Instead of reacting to every thought with fear or urgency, a calm mind observes thoughts with patience. It recognizes that thoughts are temporary mental events rather than absolute truths. For example, imagine facing a difficult decision in life. If the mind is filled with worry, the decision may feel extremely stressful. The mind may jump from one possibility to another, imagining negative outcomes and creating confusion. This mental noise makes it difficult to think clearly, but when the mind becomes calm, the same decision can be approached with greater clarity. The person is able to examine the situation carefully without becoming overwhelmed by fear. This clarity allows wiser choices to appear naturally. A calm mind can observe details that a worried mind often overlooks. It can recognize what truly matters and what can be released. In this way, calmness becomes a powerful tool for understanding life more deeply. The Buddha often compared the mind to water. When water is stirred and disturbed, its surface becomes cloudy and unclear. If someone looks into disturbed water, they cannot see the bottom clearly. But when the water becomes still, the surface becomes transparent, and everything beneath it becomes visible. The same principle applies to the mind. When worry constantly agitates the mind, understanding becomes distorted. But when the mind becomes still, clarity naturally appears. Many people believe that constantly thinking about their problems will eventually lead to better solutions. However, excessive thinking often leads to more confusion rather than clarity. Worry tends to repeat the same thoughts without producing new insight. It creates mental circles where the mind keeps revisiting the same fears again and again. Calmness breaks this cycle. When the mind relaxes, it gains the space needed to see situations from a wider perspective. Instead of reacting immediately to every difficulty, a calm mind pauses and observes carefully. This pause creates room for wisdom to arise. Another important benefit of a calm mind is emotional balance. Worry often amplifies emotions such as fear, frustration, and impatience. These emotional reactions can lead people to make decisions they later regret. A calm mind, on the other hand, responds to emotions with awareness. Instead of being carried away by sudden reactions, a person becomes capable of responding thoughtfully. This emotional balance strengthens relationships and improves communication. When someone approaches situations with calmness, they listen more carefully and speak more thoughtfully. Conflicts that might escalate quickly in a worried mind can often be resolved peacefully when approached with clarity. The Buddha also taught that calmness allows a person to recognize the impermanent nature of life more easily. When the mind is overwhelmed by worry, it tends to treat every problem as if it will last forever. But when the mind becomes calm, it begins to see that all situations eventually change. Difficult moments pass, emotions shift, and circumstances evolve with time. This understanding reduces fear because the mind no longer views temporary challenges as permanent threats. Instead, difficulties are seen as natural parts of life that can be faced with patience and wisdom. Developing a calm mind requires practice. The mind has often spent years developing the habit of worrying, so it may not become peaceful instantly. But each moment of awareness helps weaken the habit of anxious thinking. Simple practices such as mindful breathing, quiet reflection, and paying attention to the present moment gradually train the mind to settle. With time, these small moments of calm begin to grow stronger. The mind becomes less reactive and more stable. Thoughts continue to appear, but they no longer control the entire experience of the mind. Instead of being carried away by every worry, a person begins to observe their thoughts with calm awareness. This transformation creates a powerful sense of inner freedom. Life still includes challenges, responsibilities, and unexpected events. But a calm mind approaches these situations with clarity rather than panic. Problems become opportunities to respond with wisdom instead of triggers for endless worry. Eventually, a person begins to realize that calmness itself is a form of strength. It allows the mind to remain steady even when circumstances are uncertain. It provides the clarity needed to make wise decisions and the patience needed to navigate difficult moments. In this way, a calm mind becomes one of the most valuable qualities a person can develop. It allows life to be experienced with greater understanding and less unnecessary suffering. When worry no longer dominates the mind, the world becomes easier to understand and the path forward becomes clearer. The Buddha's teachings remind us that peace and clarity are not distant goals waiting somewhere in the future. They are qualities that begin to appear the moment the mind learns to settle, observe, and release the constant habit of worry. When the mind becomes calm, life itself becomes easier to see, easier to understand, and easier to live. 11. True freedom appears when the mind stops clinging. One of the deepest teachings in Buddhism is the idea that much of human suffering is created by the mind's habit of clinging. The mind constantly holds on to things and becomes attached to them. It clings to expectations about how life should unfold. It clings to people and their opinions. It clings to memories from the past, and it clings to imagined outcomes in the future. When these attachments are threatened or when life does not move according to those expectations, the mind begins to worry. Worry grows out of this constant need to hold on tightly to what feels familiar or safe. Most people do not realize how deeply this habit of clinging shapes their thoughts. A person may become attached to a certain plan for their future. They imagine that life must move in a particular direction for them to feel happy or secure. When something interrupts that plan, the mind immediately begins worrying about what will happen next. The mind tries to regain control by imagining every possible outcome, hoping that constant thinking will somehow bring stability back. But the truth is that the more tightly the mind clings, the more fragile it becomes when life changes. The Buddha observed that everything in life is constantly changing. Situations change, people change, emotions change, and circumstances shift in ways that cannot always be predicted. Because change is unavoidable, clinging to fixed expectations often leads to disappointment and anxiety. When the mind insists that life must remain a certain way, every change begins to feel like a threat. Worry then becomes the mind's attempt to resist the natural movement of life. For example, a person might become attached to a particular image of success. They imagine that their life must reach a certain level of achievement by a specific time. If progress moves slower than expected, the mind begins worrying about failure and judgment from others. Another person might cling to the approval of friends or family. When they sense even the smallest sign of criticism or disagreement, the mind fills with anxious thoughts about losing that approval. In both cases, the worry does not come only from the situation itself. It grows from the attachment the mind has created around that situation. The tighter the mind holds on to something, the more fear appears when that thing becomes uncertain. The Buddha taught that freedom begins when a person learns to loosen this grip. Letting go does not mean abandoning everything or becoming indifferent to life. Instead, it means learning to engage with life without becoming trapped by attachment. When the mind stops clinging so tightly, it becomes more flexible and resilient. Imagine holding a handful of sand in your palm. If you squeeze the sand tightly, it quickly slips through your fingers. But if you hold your hand open and relaxed, the sand rests gently in your palm. In a similar way, when the mind clings tightly to outcomes, relationships, and expectations, it creates tension and fear. But when the mind becomes more open and relaxed, life can be experienced with greater balance. Letting go of clinging changes the way worry appears in the mind. When the mind is no longer desperately trying to control every outcome, it stops reacting to every small uncertainty with fear. Instead of imagining endless negative possibilities, the mind becomes more willing to trust the unfolding of life. This shift creates a surprising sense of freedom. The mind begins to realize that many of the worries it carried for years were connected to attachments that were never truly stable. By loosening those attachments, the mind becomes lighter and more peaceful. Another powerful transformation occurs in the way a person experiences success and failure. When the mind clings strongly to success, failure becomes terrifying. Every mistake feels like a threat to identity and self-worth. But when the mind becomes less attached to specific outcomes, failure loses its ability to create overwhelming worry. Instead of seeing failure as a disaster, it becomes simply another experience from which learning can grow. The same principle applies to relationships. When attachment becomes extreme, the mind begins worrying constantly about losing people or disappointing them. But when relationships are approached with understanding rather than clinging, the mind becomes more peaceful. Love and connection remain strong, yet they are no longer burdened by fear and anxiety. The Buddha often emphasized that clinging is closely connected to the illusion of permanence. The mind wants things to remain exactly as they are when they bring comfort or happiness. But because life is always changing, this desire for permanence creates tension. Worry becomes the mind's reaction to the possibility that something might change. When a person begins to accept the truth of impermanence, their relationship with life becomes more relaxed. They understand that every experience, whether pleasant or difficult, is temporary. Instead of clinging tightly to moments, they learn to appreciate them while they are present. This understanding creates a deeper form of gratitude. When the mind knows that moments are temporary, it begins to value them more fully. Instead of worrying about what might happen next, a person becomes more attentive to what is happening now. Each experience becomes more vivid because it is not overshadowed by constant fear about the future. Letting go of clinging also strengthens inner stability. A person who depends entirely on external circumstances for peace will always feel vulnerable. When happiness depends on perfect outcomes or approval from others, worry will constantly appear. But when peace begins to grow from within, external changes lose their ability to disturb the mind so deeply. This inner stability does not remove challenges from life, but it changes the way those challenges are experienced. Difficult moments are approached with patience instead of panic. Uncertainty is faced with curiosity instead of fear. The mind becomes more capable of adapting because it is no longer trapped by rigid attachments. Practicing this kind of letting go requires awareness. The mind has often spent years strengthening the habit of clinging, so the process of releasing those attachments takes time. But each moment of awareness weakens the old patterns. Whenever a person notices that their mind is holding too tightly to an expectation or fear, they have the opportunity to gently relax that grip. Over time, this practice creates a quieter and more spacious mind. Worry begins to appear less frequently because the mind is no longer trying to control every detail of life. Instead of reacting with fear to uncertainty, the mind becomes more willing to trust its ability to navigate whatever arises. Eventually, a person begins to experience a profound realization. The freedom they were searching for was never dependent on controlling life perfectly. It was hidden within their ability to release the constant habit of clinging. When the mind stops gripping every expectation, life becomes easier to move through. Experiences are welcomed without excessive attachment, and difficulties are faced without overwhelming fear. The mind becomes lighter because it is no longer carrying the heavy burden of trying to hold everything in place. In this way, true freedom begins to appear. It is not the freedom that comes from escaping life's challenges, but the freedom that comes from meeting those challenges with an open and balanced mind. Without the weight of constant clinging, worry gradually fades, and a deeper peace begins to take its place. This is one of the central insights of Buddhist wisdom. When the mind learns to release its attachments, it discovers that peace was never dependent on perfect circumstances. It was always waiting quietly beneath the worries created by clinging. 12. Peace grows when the mind learns to trust the flow of life. One of the quiet reasons people live with constant worry is because the mind struggles to trust the natural flow of life. The mind wants certainty, guarantees, and clear answers about what will happen next. It wants to know that plans will succeed, that relationships will remain stable, and that the future will unfold exactly as imagined. When life begins moving in unpredictable directions, the mind reacts with anxiety. It tries to regain control by thinking about every possible outcome, repeating scenarios again and again in hopes of feeling prepared. But this constant effort to control the unknown often creates more worry rather than less. The Buddha observed that life has always moved according to change and uncertainty. Nothing in the world remains fixed forever. Seasons change, people grow older, circumstances evolve, and situations appear and disappear with time. When the mind resists this natural movement, it becomes tense. It tries to freeze life into a predictable shape, yet life continues flowing forward. Worry often arises from this conflict between the mind's desire for control and the reality of constant change. Many people grow up believing that peace will only appear once everything in life becomes stable and predictable. They imagine that if they can control their future perfectly, worry will disappear. But life rarely offers such certainty. Even when things seem secure, unexpected events can still arise. Because of this, the search for absolute control often becomes an endless struggle. Buddhism teaches a different way of approaching life. Instead of trying to control every possible outcome, a person can learn to trust their ability to move with life as it unfolds. This trust does not mean ignoring responsibility or abandoning effort. It means understanding that while we can influence certain things through our actions, many aspects of life will always remain beyond our control. When a person begins to accept this truth, a quiet shift occurs in the mind. Instead of exhausting itself by predicting every possible problem, the mind starts focusing on the present moment. Attention moves toward what can actually be done now, rather than endlessly imagining what might happen later. This change alone can remove a large amount of unnecessary worry. Trusting the flow of life also means recognizing that human beings are more capable of adapting than they often believe. When worry dominates the mind, it tends to assume that future challenges will be impossible to handle. It imagines worst-case scenarios and convinces itself that everything will collapse if those situations occur. Yet when people look back on their lives, they often discover that they have already faced many unexpected challenges and found ways to move through them. Life has a way of presenting difficulties and then slowly guiding people toward solutions they could not have predicted in advance. New opportunities appear, supportive people enter our lives, and unexpected strengths emerge within us. These possibilities are often invisible when the mind is trapped in worry, because worry narrows the mind's perspective. The Buddha encouraged people to cultivate patience and trust in the unfolding of life. Just as a seed grows slowly beneath the soil before it becomes visible, many outcomes in life develop gradually over time. When a person constantly worries about the future, they may forget that many things require patience to grow and mature. Trusting the flow of life also helps a person respond more calmly to uncertainty. When the mind accepts that uncertainty is natural, it stops treating every unknown situation as a threat. Instead of reacting with fear, the mind becomes curious and attentive. It begins observing how situations develop rather than trying to force immediate answers. This shift creates a deeper sense of inner stability. The mind no longer depends entirely on external certainty to feel peaceful. Instead, peace begins growing from the understanding that whatever happens, it will be faced step by step when the moment arrives. Another important aspect of trusting life is learning to release the habit of overthinking. Overthinking often disguises itself as preparation. The mind tells itself that if it analyzes every possibility, it will be ready for whatever happens. But most of the time, this process only creates more confusion and anxiety. The future remains uncertain regardless of how many times the mind tries to imagine it. When the mind learns to trust life more deeply, it becomes willing to let go of excessive mental analysis. It understands that not every question needs an immediate answer, and not every situation requires constant thought. This willingness to pause allows the mind to rest. Rest is essential for clarity. When the mind is always racing ahead into the future, it becomes exhausted. But when it pauses and returns to the present moment, its natural intelligence begins to function more clearly. Decisions become easier because they are not buried beneath layers of anxious thinking. Trust also changes the way people approach mistakes and unexpected outcomes. When the mind demands perfection from life, every mistake becomes a source of worry and self-criticism. But when the mind trusts the flow of life, mistakes are seen as part of the learning process. Instead of fearing them, a person begins to view them as opportunities to grow and understand life more deeply. The Buddha often reminded people that wisdom develops through experience. Each situation, whether pleasant or difficult, contains lessons that can guide us forward. When worry dominates the mind, these lessons are often hidden beneath fear. But when the mind becomes calmer and more trusting, it becomes easier to see the meaning behind life's experiences. Over time, this trust creates a profound transformation in the way life is lived. A person becomes less afraid of uncertainty because they no longer feel the need to control every detail. Instead of being trapped in endless worry about what might happen, they begin engaging with life as it unfolds. This does not mean that life becomes free of challenges. Difficult moments will still arise, and uncertainty will always exist to some degree. But the difference lies in the mind's response. A mind that trusts life does not react with immediate panic. It pauses, observes, and responds thoughtfully. Gradually, the mind begins to experience a quieter kind of confidence. It is not the confidence that comes from knowing exactly what the future will bring, but the confidence that comes from trusting one's ability to face whatever arises. This kind of confidence cannot be created through endless worrying. It grows through awareness, patience, and acceptance of life's natural flow. When the mind stops fighting the unknown and begins trusting the unfolding of life, a deeper peace begins to appear. Worry loses its urgency because the mind understands that not every outcome must be predicted in advance. Instead of living in constant anticipation of problems, a person becomes more present with the experiences of each day. The Buddha's teachings remind us that life is not meant to be controlled like a machine. It moves more like a river, flowing through changing landscapes and unexpected turns. When we stop trying to control the river and learn to move with it instead, our journey becomes far less stressful. In this way, peace grows naturally. It does not appear because life has become perfectly predictable, but because the mind has learned to trust the movement of life itself. When that trust develops, worry slowly fades, and a calmer, more balanced way of living begins to take its place. 13. The mind finds peace when it stops chasing every thought. One of the deepest habits of the human mind is its constant urge to chase every thought that appears. Thoughts arise one after another, often without pause, and the mind quickly begins following them wherever they lead. Some thoughts are useful and help us solve real problems, but many are simply mental noise, memories, fears, imagined conversations, or predictions about the future. When the mind automatically chases every one of these thoughts, it becomes restless and overwhelmed. This restlessness is one of the hidden sources of constant worry. The Buddha observed that the mind often behaves like a monkey jumping from branch to branch in a forest. It rarely stays still. One moment it is thinking about the past, the next moment it is worrying about the future, and soon after it is imagining something entirely different. Because of this constant movement, many people feel mentally exhausted even when their external lives appear calm. The mind keeps traveling through endless thoughts, and worry becomes one of its most frequent destinations. When a worrying thought appears, the mind usually reacts immediately. Instead of simply noticing the thought, it begins expanding it. It imagines possible consequences, predicts future outcomes, and searches for answers that do not yet exist. A single small thought can quickly grow into a long chain of anxious thinking. By the time the mind finishes building this story, the person may feel overwhelmed, even though the original situation was very small. This process often happens automatically because the mind has been practicing it for years. From a young age, many people are taught to analyze every situation, to anticipate problems, and to constantly think ahead. While planning and careful thinking can sometimes be helpful, the habit of chasing every thought can easily turn into a pattern of endless worry. The Buddha taught that freedom from this pattern begins with awareness. Awareness allows a person to step back and observe their thoughts instead of being carried away by them. When you begin watching your thoughts carefully, you notice something interesting. Thoughts appear on their own, but they only become powerful when the mind follows them. Imagine standing beside a road and watching cars pass by. Each car represents a thought moving through the mind. If you remain standing on the side of the road, the cars simply pass by. But if you jump into every car that passes, you will be carried far away from where you started. In the same way, when the mind jumps into every thought, it becomes lost in endless mental journeys. Worry grows strongest when the mind repeatedly enters these thoughts and continues building them. But when awareness is present, a different possibility appears. Instead of chasing every thought, you can simply observe it as it passes through the mind. This observation creates space between you and the thought. At first, this may feel unusual because the mind is used to reacting automatically. But with practice, you begin to notice that many thoughts fade away naturally when they are not followed. Just like clouds drifting across the sky, thoughts come and go if the mind does not cling to them. The Buddha described this ability as a form of mental discipline. It does not mean suppressing thoughts or forcing the mind to become empty. Instead, it means recognizing that you have the ability to choose which thoughts deserve your attention. Some thoughts may require careful reflection, while others can simply be allowed to pass without engagement. This simple shift changes the entire experience of the mind. When the mind stops chasing every thought, it becomes quieter and more stable. Worry loses much of its strength because the mind is no longer feeding it with constant attention. Instead of growing into long mental stories, worrying thoughts appear briefly and then fade away. Another benefit of this awareness is the return of mental energy. Constant thinking consumes a large amount of attention and emotional strength. When the mind is always jumping between worries, it becomes tired and unfocused. But when the habit of chasing thoughts begins to fade, the mind feels lighter. Energy that was previously spent on endless worrying becomes available for clearer thinking and meaningful action. This calmness also improves concentration. A restless mind often struggles to focus on simple tasks because it is constantly distracted by new thoughts. But when the mind becomes more disciplined, it can remain present with whatever activity is happening. Work becomes easier, conversations become more attentive, and everyday experiences become richer. The Buddha often encouraged people to practice mindfulness as a way to strengthen this awareness. Mindfulness means paying attention to the present moment without judgment. By focusing on breathing, bodily sensations, or simple activities, the mind gradually becomes less reactive to passing thoughts. For example, when you sit quietly and observe your breath, thoughts will naturally appear. Some may try to pull your attention away into worry or planning. Instead of following them, you gently return your attention to the breath. Each time you do this, you strengthen the ability to remain present instead of chasing thoughts. Over time, this practice begins to change the mind's habits. Thoughts still appear, but they lose their ability to dominate attention so easily. The mind becomes more like a clear sky rather than a storm filled with constant mental activity. As this clarity grows, worry begins to lose its power. The mind understands that not every thought requires action or emotional reaction. Some thoughts are simply temporary visitors that pass through the mind's space. This realization creates a profound sense of freedom. Many people spend years believing that they are trapped inside their worries, unable to escape the constant movement of anxious thinking. But when awareness develops, they discover that they have far more control over their attention than they once believed. Freedom does not come from eliminating every thought. Thoughts are a natural part of the mind. Instead, freedom appears when the mind stops chasing every thought that arises. The space created by this awareness allows peace to grow naturally. Eventually, a person begins to notice that moments of quiet become more frequent. The mind feels less crowded, and the present moment becomes easier to experience. Instead of constantly living inside thoughts about the future, life begins to unfold more clearly in front of them. This is one of the great insights taught by the Buddha. The mind does not need to control or eliminate every thought in order to find peace. It simply needs to stop chasing them endlessly. When the mind learns to watch thoughts without following them, worry begins to fade. In its place appears a deeper calm, a steady awareness, and a quiet understanding that peace was always available beneath the endless movement of the mind. 14. Gratitude, quietly, replaces worry. One of the most powerful shifts that can happen inside the mind is the movement from worry toward gratitude. Worry and gratitude cannot grow strongly in the mind at the same time because they direct attention in completely different directions. Worry focuses the mind on what might go wrong, what might be missing, or what might be lost in the future. Gratitude, on the other hand, gently turns the mind toward what already exists, what is already working, and what is already present in this moment of life. When the mind learns to recognize and appreciate what is already here, many worries begin to lose their intensity. The Buddha often spoke about the importance of awareness and appreciation for the simple realities of life. Many people move through their days without noticing the countless things that quietly support their existence. They breathe without thinking about the miracle of breath. They wake up to a new day without recognizing the rare opportunity that another day of life provides. They eat food, walk under the sky, speak with loved ones, and experience moments of calm without pausing to acknowledge how meaningful these moments truly are. When awareness is missing, the mind naturally drifts toward worry because it becomes focused on imagined problems rather than present blessings. Gratitude changes this direction of attention. It gently brings the mind back to the present moment and invites it to notice what is already here. Instead of scanning the future for possible dangers, the mind begins observing the quiet support that life is already offering. A roof above the head, a meal on the table, the presence of people who care, the ability to move, think, breathe, and experience the world. These simple realities often go unnoticed until awareness begins to grow. When gratitude becomes part of daily awareness, the mind slowly becomes less interested in feeding endless worries. This does not mean that challenges disappear or that life becomes perfect. Difficult situations still arise because change and uncertainty are natural parts of life. But gratitude changes the way the mind relates to those situations. Instead of feeling surrounded by problems, the mind begins to recognize that many aspects of life remain steady and supportive even during difficult times. The Buddha taught that the mind tends to follow whatever it repeatedly focuses on. If a person constantly focuses on fears and imagined problems, the mind will become filled with anxiety. But if attention begins returning to moments of appreciation and awareness, the mind gradually becomes calmer and more balanced. This transformation does not require dramatic changes in external circumstances. It begins with a subtle shift in perception. For example, consider how often people worry about the future. They imagine possible failures, financial difficulties, or uncertain outcomes that might appear later in life. These worries can easily dominate the mind because the future feels unknown and unpredictable. But when a person pauses and notices what is already present in the current moment, the intensity of those worries often decreases. The mind realizes that, at least right now, many things are stable and functioning well. Gratitude also reminds the mind that life contains far more support than it sometimes recognizes. Every day, countless small things occur that make life possible. The body continues working quietly without constant attention. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, and the mind processes information with remarkable complexity. Nature provides sunlight, air, water, and the conditions necessary for life to exist. Even the presence of other people contributes to our well-being in ways we often overlook. When awareness begins noticing these quiet supports, the mind develops a deeper sense of trust in life. Instead of feeling as though everything depends entirely on personal control, a person begins to recognize the vast network of conditions that continuously support their existence. This recognition softens the need to worry about controlling every detail of the future. Another important aspect of gratitude is its ability to shift emotional energy. Worry often creates tension in the body and mind. The heart rate increases, thoughts become rapid, and the mind feels restless. Gratitude, by contrast, tends to slow the mind and create a sense of warmth and calmness. When a person reflects on something they genuinely appreciate, the body relaxes and the mind becomes more peaceful. This emotional shift is not imaginary. It reflects a real change in mental activity. The mind begins focusing on experiences that generate calm rather than fear. Over time, this repeated focus strengthens patterns of appreciation rather than patterns of anxiety. Gratitude also encourages humility and perspective. When a person becomes aware of the many things supporting their life, they begin to understand that not everything depends on personal effort alone. Many opportunities, relationships, and experiences arrive through circumstances beyond individual control. This understanding reduces the pressure the mind places on itself to manage everything perfectly. In addition, gratitude deepens connections with others. When the mind appreciates the presence of other people, relationships become less burdened by expectation and more guided by understanding. Instead of worrying constantly about what others think or how they might behave, a person becomes more attentive to the value of shared moments. The Buddha often reminded people that gratitude can transform ordinary experiences into meaningful ones. A simple meal becomes more satisfying when it is approached with appreciation rather than distraction. A conversation becomes richer when it is experienced with awareness. Even quiet moments of stillness become sources of peace when the mind recognizes their value. Practicing gratitude does not require dramatic gestures. It can begin with small moments of reflection. At the end of a day, a person might pause and remember a few simple things that brought comfort or meaning. It might be a kind word from someone, a moment of calm during a busy day, or even the simple experience of breathing fresh air. These small reflections gradually train the mind to notice what is already working, rather than constantly searching for what might go wrong. As this habit grows stronger, the mind naturally becomes less attracted to endless worrying. Over time, the relationship between worry and gratitude becomes clearer. Worry attempts to protect the future by imagining problems, while gratitude appreciates the present by recognizing existing blessings. When attention shifts toward gratitude, worry begins to lose its central place in the mind. This shift does not happen instantly. The habit of worrying may have developed over many years, and changing that habit requires patience. But each moment of appreciation gently weakens the old pattern. With continued awareness, gratitude begins appearing more naturally. Eventually, a person may notice that their mind feels lighter and more peaceful than before. Worries still appear occasionally, but they no longer dominate attention so easily. Gratitude creates balance by reminding the mind that life contains many sources of support and meaning. The Buddha's teachings often guide people back to this simple realization. Peace does not always come from eliminating every challenge or controlling every outcome. Sometimes it grows quietly when the mind begins appreciating what is already present. In this way, gratitude becomes a powerful antidote to worry. It transforms the direction of attention, softens the grip of fear, and opens the mind to the richness of the present moment. When gratitude grows stronger, worry naturally becomes quieter, and a deeper sense of peace begins to take its place. 15. The mind becomes free when you realize you are not your worries. One of the most profound realizations a person can experience is understanding that they are not the worries that appear in their mind. For most of their lives, many people believe that every thought they experience represents who they are. If the mind produces anxious thoughts, they believe they must be an anxious person. If the mind imagines fearful outcomes, they assume fear is part of their identity. Because of this belief, people often feel trapped inside their worries, as if there is no separation between themselves and the thoughts passing through their mind. The Buddha taught a powerful insight that changes this entire perspective. He explained that thoughts are not permanent parts of the self. Thoughts are simply mental events that appear, exist briefly, and then disappear. They arise from conditions such as memories, emotions, past experiences, and external influences. When those conditions change, the thoughts also change. In this way, thoughts are more like passing weather than permanent truths. However, the mind often creates the illusion that these thoughts define who we are. When a worrying thought appears, the mind quickly says, "This is my worry, this is my fear." By identifying with the thought, the person begins carrying it as if it is part of their identity. Over time, repeated identification with these thoughts strengthens the belief that worry is something deeply personal and unavoidable. The Buddha encouraged people to look more closely at this process. When you observe your thoughts carefully, you begin to notice something interesting. Thoughts appear in the mind automatically. They do not ask for permission before arriving. A thought about the future might appear suddenly, followed by a memory from the past, followed by a completely unrelated idea. This constant movement reveals that thoughts are not controlled as precisely as we often assume. If thoughts appear and disappear on their own, then they cannot truly define who we are. They are experiences happening within the mind, but they are not the core of our being. Understanding this difference creates a powerful sense of space between the observer and the thought. Imagine sitting beside a river and watching the water flow past. Leaves, branches, and other objects float along the current. You can observe them passing by without needing to jump into the river and follow them downstream. In a similar way, thoughts flow through the mind like objects moving along a current. When a person believes they must follow every thought, they become swept away by the flow. But when awareness develops, they can simply observe the thoughts as they pass. Worry often loses much of its strength when this separation becomes clear. Instead of thinking, "I am worried," a person begins to recognize a worrying thought has appeared in the mind. This small shift in language reflects a deeper change in perception. The thought is no longer treated as the self, but as an event happening within the mind's experience. This distinction may seem subtle, but it has powerful consequences. When worry is viewed as part of identity, it becomes extremely difficult to release. But when it is recognized as a temporary mental event, it becomes easier to observe without becoming trapped inside it. The Buddha described this awareness as a form of liberation. Liberation does not mean eliminating every thought or emotion. The mind will always produce thoughts because that is part of its nature. Liberation means no longer being controlled by every thought that appears. When a person realizes they are not their worries, the relationship with the mind changes dramatically. Instead of trying to suppress anxious thoughts or fighting against them, the person simply observes them with calm attention. This observation often causes the thoughts to fade naturally because they are no longer receiving the emotional energy that strengthens them. Another important aspect of this realization is understanding that worries often arise from conditions that change over time. A person may worry intensely about a situation one day, yet the same situation might feel far less important a few weeks later. This change demonstrates that worries are not fixed parts of the self. They shift depending on circumstances, mood, and perspective. For example, imagine a person worrying about an upcoming event. Their mind repeatedly imagines things going wrong, and the anxiety feels overwhelming. But once the event passes, the worry disappears quickly. Looking back, the person may even wonder why the worry felt so intense at the time. This experience reveals that worry was not a permanent part of their identity, but simply a temporary pattern of thinking. Recognizing this temporary nature weakens the grip of worry. When a worrying thought appears, a person can remind themselves that thoughts are not permanent truths. They are experiences that rise and fall, like waves on the surface of the ocean. The Buddha also emphasized the importance of mindfulness in developing this awareness. Mindfulness allows a person to observe their mental activity without judgment. Instead of reacting immediately to every thought, the person learns to watch the movement of the mind with curiosity and patience. Through mindfulness, a person begins to see that thoughts follow patterns. Certain situations trigger familiar worries, and certain emotions bring specific thoughts to the surface. Observing these patterns creates understanding. Instead of feeling controlled by the mind, a person begins to recognize how the mind operates. With this understanding comes a new sense of freedom. If thoughts are patterns that appear within the mind, rather than permanent parts of identity, then those patterns can change. Just as habits in daily behavior can be transformed with practice, habits of thinking can also evolve. This transformation does not require forcing the mind to become silent. Instead, it develops through gentle awareness and repeated observation. Each time a person notices a worrying thought without becoming entangled in it, the mind learns a new response. Over time, these moments of awareness accumulate and gradually weaken the old habit of automatic worry. Another benefit of recognizing that you are not your worries is the ability to respond to life with greater compassion toward yourself. Many people judge themselves harshly when they experience anxious thoughts. They believe something is wrong with them for feeling worried or fearful. But when worries are understood as temporary mental events rather than personal failures, this harsh self-judgment begins to soften. Compassion toward oneself allows the mind to relax. Instead of creating additional suffering through criticism, a person treats their worries with patience and understanding. This gentle approach encourages the mind to settle naturally. As awareness grows, a person begins to notice that beneath the constant movement of thoughts, there is a quieter presence. This presence is the simple awareness that observes the mind's activity. While thoughts appear and disappear continuously, this awareness remains steady. The Buddha often pointed toward this deeper awareness as the foundation of inner peace. When a person learns to rest in this awareness, rather than being pulled into every thought, the mind experiences a profound sense of freedom. Thoughts continue to arise, but they no longer dominate the entire experience of the mind. This freedom does not remove challenges from life, but it changes the way those challenges are experienced. A worrying thought may appear, but it is recognized as just another passing event rather than an overwhelming truth. Because of this recognition, the mind remains more stable even during difficult moments. Gradually, the mind becomes less reactive. Situations that once triggered intense worry begin to feel more manageable. Instead of being swept away by every anxious thought, a person responds with calm observation. This transformation reveals a powerful truth taught by the Buddha. The mind becomes free, not by eliminating every worry, but by understanding its true nature. When worries are seen clearly as temporary thoughts rather than permanent identities, they lose their ability to dominate the mind. In this way, the realization that you are not your worries becomes one of the most liberating insights a person can experience. It opens the door to a quieter mind, a calmer heart, and a deeper sense of peace. Thoughts will continue to appear and disappear as long as the mind exists. But once you understand that you are the awareness observing those thoughts rather than the thoughts themselves, worry no longer holds the same power. The mind becomes lighter, more spacious, and far more peaceful than before. And within that spacious awareness, a person begins to experience a freedom that worry could never allow. 16. Patience is the quiet power that dissolves worry. One of the quiet reasons worry grows so easily in the human mind is impatience. The mind constantly wants immediate answers, quick solutions, and clear outcomes. When something uncertain appears in life, the mind immediately tries to resolve it as fast as possible. It wants to know how everything will turn out, when problems will disappear, and whether the future will unfold safely. When these answers do not appear instantly, worry begins to grow. The Buddha often taught that impatience creates unnecessary suffering because life does not move according to the speed of our thoughts. The mind can travel far into the future within seconds, imagining outcomes and predicting possibilities, but real life unfolds slowly, step by step, moment by moment. When the mind races ahead of reality, it becomes trapped in worries about situations that have not even developed yet. Patience is the quality that gently brings the mind back into harmony with the natural pace of life. Instead of forcing answers to appear immediately, patience allows events to unfold gradually. It accepts that many situations require time, experience, and natural development before clarity appears. Many worries are created because the mind tries to solve problems that are not yet ready to be solved. Imagine planting a seed in the soil. The seed needs water, sunlight, and time before it grows into a plant. If someone digs up the soil every hour to check whether the seed has grown, they will only disturb the process. In the same way, when the mind constantly checks the future for answers, it often interferes with the natural unfolding of life. The Buddha encouraged people to understand that many answers appear only through patience. Some situations cannot be solved through constant thinking. They become clear through time, experience, and the quiet observation of how life develops. When patience grows, the relationship between the mind and uncertainty begins to change. Instead of reacting to uncertainty with anxiety, the mind becomes willing to wait. Waiting does not mean doing nothing. It means allowing life the space it needs to reveal its direction. For example, consider a person who is worried about an important decision in their life. The mind may rush between possibilities, imagining every possible outcome and trying to determine the perfect choice. This intense thinking often creates more confusion rather than clarity, but when patience is present, the person gives themselves time to observe the situation carefully. Instead of forcing an answer immediately, they allow understanding to grow naturally. Often, after some time passes, the situation becomes clearer on its own. New information appears, emotions settle, and the mind becomes calmer. The decision that once felt impossible begins to feel more obvious. This clarity was not created by worrying, but by allowing patience to guide the process. Patience also transforms the way people experience difficulties. Many challenges in life require time to resolve. Emotional wounds, complicated relationships, personal growth, and meaningful achievements all develop gradually. When the mind expects immediate results, it becomes frustrated and anxious when progress appears slow. The Buddha taught that true growth rarely happens instantly. Just as a tree grows slowly over many years, wisdom and inner strength also develop through time and experience. Patience allows a person to trust this gradual process rather than becoming discouraged by temporary difficulties. Another important aspect of patience is its calming effect on the mind. Worry often creates a sense of urgency, as if something terrible will happen unless the mind solves every problem immediately. This urgency pushes the mind into constant thinking and tension. Patience softens this urgency by reminding the mind that not every situation requires instant resolution. When patience is present, the mind becomes more stable. Instead of rushing toward imagined solutions, it observes the present moment carefully. This calm observation often reveals details that worry would have hidden. Patience also improves relationships with others. Many worries involve other people, their actions, opinions, and responses. When impatience dominates the mind, a person may react quickly with frustration or fear. But when patience is present, there is space to listen, understand, and respond more thoughtfully. The Buddha often described patience as a form of strength rather than weakness. In many cultures, impatience is mistakenly associated with productivity and determination. People believe that constant action and quick results are signs of success. But true strength often lies in the ability to remain calm while situations develop slowly. Patience allows a person to endure uncertainty without losing balance. It gives the mind the resilience needed to face difficulties without becoming overwhelmed by worry. Another powerful benefit of patience is that it helps the mind release the illusion of control. Much of worry comes from the desire to control every outcome. The mind believes that if it can think about a problem long enough, it will eventually control the future. But life rarely follows such precise plans. Patience gently reminds the mind that control has limits. While we can influence certain aspects of life through our actions, many events will always remain beyond our control. Accepting this reality does not create weakness. Instead, it frees the mind from the exhausting task of trying to control everything. When patience replaces this need for control, the mind becomes lighter. Instead of constantly predicting the future, it focuses on responding wisely to the present moment. Each step is taken with awareness rather than fear. The Buddha also taught that patience protects the mind from unnecessary emotional reactions. When something unexpected happens, impatience often triggers anger, frustration, or anxiety. But patience creates a pause between the event and the reaction. In that pause, wisdom can arise. This pause allows a person to ask important questions. Is this situation truly as serious as it seems? Will it matter in the long run? What response will bring the most understanding rather than more conflict? Often these questions reveal that the situation is not as urgent or threatening as the mind first believed. With patience, many problems shrink to their true size instead of growing larger through worry. Patience also deepens trust in life itself. When a person repeatedly experiences how situations evolve naturally over time, they begin to realize that not everything requires immediate intervention. Life has its own rhythm and intelligence. Many events resolve themselves when given enough time. This trust does not mean abandoning responsibility. Instead, it means recognizing when effort is helpful and when patience is more appropriate. Sometimes the most effective response to uncertainty is simply allowing life to unfold. Over time, patience becomes a powerful ally in dissolving worry. The mind learns that it does not need to chase every answer immediately. It learns that clarity often appears when the mind becomes quiet enough to observe patiently. As patience grows stronger, worry gradually loses its urgency. Situations that once triggered intense anxiety begin to feel more manageable. The mind develops confidence in its ability to navigate life step by step, rather than trying to control the entire future. Eventually, a person begins to see that patience itself is a form of wisdom. It teaches the mind to move at the same pace as life, instead of racing ahead into imagined fears. It reminds us that many answers reveal themselves only when the mind is calm enough to wait. In this way, patience becomes one of the quiet powers that transforms worry into understanding. When the mind learns to wait with calm awareness, the constant pressure to control the future begins to fade, and in that calm waiting, a deeper peace slowly begins to grow. 17. Acceptance is the gate through which worry leaves the mind. One of the deepest reasons worry continues to dominate the human mind is because people struggle to accept reality as it truly is. The mind constantly compares the present moment with an imagined version of how life should be. It creates expectations about how situations should unfold, how people should behave, and how the future should appear. When reality moves in a different direction, the mind begins resisting what is happening. This resistance often becomes the root of persistent worry. The Buddha observed that much of human suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the mind's refusal to accept those events. When something unexpected occurs, the mind immediately reacts by asking why it happened or how it could have been prevented. It begins imagining alternative outcomes and replaying the situation repeatedly in thought. This process creates a mental struggle that can last far longer than the original event. For example, imagine a person facing a sudden change in their life. Perhaps a plan fails, a relationship shifts, or a situation turns out differently than expected. The mind may begin worrying about the consequences of this change. It might repeatedly ask what will happen next, or whether things will ever return to the way they once were. In many cases, the actual situation may already be manageable, but the mind's resistance transforms it into something much heavier. Acceptance changes this entire process. Acceptance does not mean approving of every event that occurs or pretending that difficulties are pleasant. Instead, acceptance means recognizing reality without immediately fighting against it in the mind. When acceptance appears, the mind stops arguing with what has already happened. This shift is powerful because resistance consumes a tremendous amount of mental energy. When the mind fights reality, it constantly revisits the same thoughts, searching for ways to change something that has already occurred. This mental struggle rarely produces solutions. Instead, it prolongs worry and keeps the mind trapped in frustration. The Buddha taught that acceptance is the beginning of wisdom because it allows the mind to see clearly. When the mind stops resisting reality, it becomes capable of understanding the situation more accurately. Clarity replaces confusion, and thoughtful responses become possible. Imagine standing in front of a closed door while trying to push it open in the wrong direction. No matter how hard you push, the door will not move because it opens the other way. Resistance works in a similar way. When the mind pushes against reality in the wrong direction, it becomes exhausted without making progress. Acceptance is the moment when the mind stops pushing and begins observing how the door actually opens. Once acceptance appears, a surprising sense of calm often follows. The mind realizes that much of the struggle it was experiencing came from its own resistance rather than from the situation itself. By acknowledging the reality of the moment, the mind frees itself from the exhausting effort of trying to control what cannot be changed. Acceptance also transforms the way people approach uncertainty. Many worries grow from the belief that the future must unfold according to specific expectations. When life moves in unexpected ways, the mind reacts with fear. But when acceptance becomes stronger, uncertainty no longer feels like a threat that must be eliminated. Instead, it becomes part of the natural movement of life. The Buddha often reminded people that life is constantly changing. Everything that exists is temporary and subject to transformation. When a person understands this truth deeply, acceptance becomes easier. Instead of expecting permanence from situations that are naturally changing, the mind becomes more flexible. Flexibility is one of the great strengths created by acceptance. A rigid mind struggles whenever life moves in unexpected directions, but a flexible mind adapts more easily. It recognizes that change is not always a sign of failure or loss, but often a natural stage in the unfolding of life. Acceptance also reduces the emotional intensity that accompanies worry. When the mind resists reality, emotions such as fear, anger, and frustration become stronger. These emotions can cloud judgment and make situations feel overwhelming. Acceptance softens these emotional reactions by allowing the mind to observe events without immediately labeling them as threats. For example, imagine receiving unexpected news that disrupts a plan you carefully prepared. The initial reaction may be disappointment or frustration. If the mind begins resisting the situation, it may start worrying about how everything will go wrong from this point forward. But when acceptance appears, the mind acknowledges the reality of the change and begins looking for new possibilities. This approach allows creative solutions to emerge. When the mind is trapped in resistance, it often sees only problems. But when acceptance clears the mental fog, new paths and opportunities can become visible. The Buddha also emphasized that acceptance helps release attachment to control. Humans naturally want to control events because control creates a sense of security. However, life rarely offers complete control. Unexpected circumstances arise, and outcomes cannot always be predicted. When the mind accepts the limits of control, it stops exhausting itself trying to manage every detail of life. Instead, it focuses on responding wisely to the situations that appear. This shift reduces worry because the mind no longer feels responsible for controlling every possible outcome. Acceptance also deepens compassion toward oneself and others. When people resist reality, they often blame themselves or others for circumstances that could not have been fully controlled. This blame creates tension in relationships and increases internal stress. Acceptance allows people to recognize that life contains many factors beyond individual control. This understanding encourages patience and kindness. Instead of reacting with anger or criticism, a person becomes more willing to understand the complexity of life's circumstances. Over time, acceptance begins to transform the way worry appears in the mind. Situations that once triggered intense anxiety become easier to face because the mind no longer fights them. Challenges are still recognized, but they are approached with calm awareness rather than resistance. This calmness does not mean becoming passive or indifferent. Acceptance actually strengthens the ability to take effective action. When the mind stops wasting energy on resistance, that energy becomes available for thoughtful responses and meaningful solutions. The Buddha often described acceptance as a doorway. When the mind passes through this doorway, it leaves behind the heavy burden of fighting reality. On the other side of the doorway lies clarity, patience, and a deeper understanding of life's natural flow. Gradually, a person begins to realize that acceptance does not weaken them. Instead, it provides the stability needed to face life with wisdom. When the mind stops resisting what already exists, it becomes free to move forward. In this freedom, worry begins to fade. The mind recognizes that many of its fears were created by the struggle against reality rather than by the situation itself. With acceptance guiding the mind, life becomes easier to navigate. Peace grows quietly in this space. It does not arrive because every problem disappears, but because the mind has learned to meet reality without fear. Acceptance becomes the gate through which worry leaves the mind, allowing a calmer and more balanced way of living to appear. 18. Wisdom begins when you see the true nature of worry. At some point in life, many people begin to question the constant presence of worry in their minds. They notice how often their thoughts move toward fear, doubt, and imagined problems about the future. They see how the mind repeatedly creates scenarios about what might go wrong, how things might fail, or how life might become difficult. For a long time, these worries feel completely real, almost as if they are unavoidable parts of life. But the Buddha taught that wisdom begins the moment a person looks more closely at the nature of worry itself. When the mind is lost in worry, it rarely stops to examine what worry actually is. Instead, it simply reacts to the thoughts as they appear. The mind treats these thoughts as urgent messages that must be solved immediately. However, when a person begins observing worry carefully, something surprising becomes visible. Worry is not the same as reality. It is the mind creating images of the future that have not yet happened. Most worries exist in the form of imagined possibilities. The mind creates a picture of a future event and then reacts emotionally to that picture. A person may imagine losing an opportunity, disappointing others, or encountering failure. Even though the situation has not occurred, the mind experiences the fear as if it were already happening. In this way, worry often causes a person to suffer from events that exist only in thought. The Buddha explained that the mind has a natural tendency to project itself forward into time. Instead of remaining in the present moment, it travels into the future, searching for possible threats. This tendency originally developed as a way to protect human beings from danger. In ancient times, being able to anticipate danger could help a person survive. However, in modern life, the same mental habit often continues, even when real danger is not present. Because of this habit, the mind sometimes treats ordinary uncertainties as if they are immediate threats. A simple situation, such as waiting for news, facing a decision, or encountering change, can trigger a long chain of anxious thoughts. The mind begins imagining negative outcomes and repeating them until the worry feels overwhelming. Wisdom begins when a person recognizes this pattern. Instead of believing every worrying thought automatically, they start observing how the mind creates these stories about the future. This observation reveals that worry is often built from imagination rather than from present reality. Imagine standing in a quiet room while your mind begins worrying about something that might happen tomorrow. At that moment, nothing harmful is actually occurring in the room. The environment may be calm and peaceful, yet the mind is producing a sense of tension because it is imagining something that might happen later. The worry exists entirely in thought. When this becomes clear, a person begins to understand that worry is not always a reliable guide. It is simply the mind exploring possible futures, many of which will never appear in real life. This realization weakens the authority that worry holds over the mind. The Buddha often encouraged people to examine their experiences directly rather than accepting them without reflection. When you examine worry closely, you can ask simple questions. Is this situation happening right now, or is it only something the mind is imagining? Is this thought helpful, or is it simply repeating fear without providing any solution? These questions bring awareness into the process of thinking. Instead of reacting automatically, the mind begins observing its own activity. This awareness creates space between the observer and the thought. Once this space appears, the intensity of worry often begins to soften. The mind realizes that it does not need to chase every thought that appears. It can watch the thought arise, exist for a moment, and then pass away. Another important insight arises when people observe how quickly worries change. A worry that feels extremely urgent today may seem far less important a week later. Some worries disappear completely once the situation passes, leaving the person wondering why they spent so much energy worrying in the first place. This pattern reveals that worry is often temporary and unstable. It depends heavily on the mood, perspective, and circumstances of the moment. When those conditions change, the worry often fades as well. The Buddha taught that understanding impermanence is one of the keys to wisdom. Everything in life is constantly changing, including thoughts and emotions. Worry may appear strong at one moment, but it will not remain exactly the same forever. Recognizing this truth allows the mind to relax its grip on anxious thoughts. Instead of believing that worry defines the future, the mind begins to see it as a passing mental event. Just as clouds move across the sky without remaining permanently, worries move through the mind and eventually dissolve. This understanding does not mean ignoring real problems. Some situations do require attention and action, but wisdom allows a person to distinguish between useful thinking and endless worrying. Useful thinking focuses on practical steps that can improve a situation. Worry, by contrast, often repeats the same fears without creating solutions. When wisdom grows, a person learns to redirect their attention toward actions that can actually influence the present moment. If a situation requires preparation or effort, they address it calmly. If the situation lies outside their control, they learn to release the mental struggle associated with it. This shift reduces unnecessary suffering. Instead of spending hours imagining possible disasters, the mind becomes focused on meaningful responses to life as it unfolds. Another powerful aspect of wisdom is the realization that the mind has the ability to change its relationship with worry. For many years, a person may believe that worrying is unavoidable. But through awareness and observation, they begin to see that they have more influence over their attention than they once believed. Each time a person notices a worrying thought and chooses not to follow it into a long chain of fear, they weaken the old habit. Over time, this repeated practice creates a new pattern in the mind. Gradually, the mind becomes less reactive. Worries still appear occasionally, but they no longer dominate attention in the same way. The mind becomes more balanced because it understands the temporary nature of thoughts. The Buddha often described wisdom as the light that reveals the true nature of experience. When wisdom illuminates the mind, illusions lose their power. Worry loses much of its authority because the mind recognizes that it is often built from imagination rather than reality. This clarity creates a deeper sense of calm. Life still contains uncertainty and change, but the mind becomes more capable of facing those uncertainties without being overwhelmed by fear. Eventually, a person begins to experience a profound shift in perspective. Instead of seeing worry as an unavoidable part of life, they see it as a mental habit that can be understood and transformed. This transformation does not require eliminating every worrying thought. Thoughts will always appear because the mind is active and creative. But wisdom allows a person to respond to those thoughts with awareness rather than automatic fear. In this way, worry gradually loses its central role in the mind. It becomes just another passing thought among many others. The mind gains the freedom to observe thoughts without becoming controlled by them. The Buddha's teachings remind us that wisdom is not something distant or mysterious. It begins with simple observation of the mind's patterns. When a person looks closely at worry and sees its true nature, a new understanding emerges. That understanding brings freedom, and within that freedom, the mind discovers a quiet peace that was hidden beneath the endless noise of worry. 19. The mind becomes light when you stop carrying every burden. One of the hidden reasons people experience constant worry is that the mind often carries far more burdens than it truly needs to. Many individuals move through life believing they must mentally hold every responsibility, every possible problem, and every future outcome inside their thoughts at all times. The mind becomes like a person carrying a heavy bag filled with worries about tomorrow, concerns about the past, and fears about situations that may never even occur. Over time, this mental weight becomes exhausting, yet many people continue carrying it because they believe it is necessary. The Buddha observed that the mind frequently creates suffering by holding on to burdens that do not truly belong to it. Some burdens come from the past memories of mistakes, regrets, or painful experiences that the mind continues replaying. Other burdens come from the future imagined situations, fears about uncertainty, or concerns about events that have not yet arrived. In both cases, the mind is carrying something that does not exist in the present moment. When a person begins to observe their mind carefully, they often discover how many of these burdens are unnecessary. The mind repeats worries about things that cannot be changed and cannot be solved in the present moment. Yet the habit of holding on to these thoughts creates a feeling of constant pressure, as if the mind must remain alert at all times to prevent something bad from happening. This habit is similar to someone walking through life carrying a heavy backpack filled with stones. Each stone represents a worry, a fear, or an expectation. Some stones come from past experiences, others from imagined futures. At first, the person may not notice the weight because they have carried the backpack for so long, but over time, the weight becomes tiring, and every step feels heavier. The Buddha taught that wisdom begins when a person realizes they do not need to carry every stone in that backpack. Many of those stones can be set down because they serve no useful purpose. When the mind releases these unnecessary burdens, it becomes lighter and more peaceful. One of the most common burdens people carry is the belief that they must control every aspect of their lives. The mind tries to anticipate every possible outcome and prepare for every scenario. It worries about making mistakes, disappointing others, or encountering unexpected challenges. This constant effort to control life creates an enormous mental load. However, life has always contained elements that lie beyond personal control. Events occur through countless conditions and interactions that no single person can fully manage. When the mind insists on controlling everything, it creates worry whenever uncertainty appears. Letting go of this burden does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means recognizing the difference between what can be influenced and what cannot. When a person focuses their energy on actions that are possible in the present moment, the mind becomes more effective and less overwhelmed. Another burden the mind often carries is the weight of other people's opinions. Many individuals spend a large portion of their mental energy worrying about how others perceive them. They imagine criticism, rejection, or judgment, even when there is little evidence that such thoughts exist in the minds of others. The Buddha encouraged people to examine this habit carefully. While it is natural to value relationships and social harmony, allowing the mind to constantly worry about others' opinions creates unnecessary suffering. People's perceptions change frequently and cannot be fully controlled. Carrying this burden only drains mental energy that could be used for personal growth and understanding. When the mind begins releasing the need to please everyone or meet every expectation, it becomes lighter. A person becomes more capable of living according to their values rather than being guided by fear of judgment. The mind also carries burdens related to the past. Memories of mistakes or painful experiences can linger for years. The mind repeatedly revisits these memories, imagining how things could have been different. While reflection can sometimes provide learning, endless rumination about the past rarely brings peace. The Buddha taught that the past is beyond alteration. No amount of worrying can change what has already occurred. However, the mind often continues carrying these memories as if holding them tightly will somehow correct them. When a person practices letting go of this burden, they begin to understand that learning from the past does not require reliving it endlessly. Once the lesson has been understood, the mind can release the memory's emotional weight. Similarly, the mind often carries burdens about the future. It imagines problems that might arise years from now and attempts to prepare for them through constant thinking. While planning can be useful, worry about distant possibilities often becomes exaggerated and unproductive. The Buddha emphasized that the future unfolds through countless changing conditions. Preparing wisely in the present moment is beneficial, but worrying endlessly about distant possibilities rarely improves outcomes. Instead, it creates tension and distracts the mind from the opportunities available right now. When the mind learns to place its attention in the present moment, many of these future burdens begin to dissolve. The present moment becomes the place where real action can occur. By focusing on what can be done now, the mind becomes more grounded and less overwhelmed by distant uncertainties. Another important burden people carry is the belief that they must solve every problem immediately. The mind treats uncertainty as something dangerous that must be eliminated quickly. When answers do not appear right away, worry intensifies. But many situations in life require time to develop. Just as a seed needs patience to grow into a plant, solutions often emerge gradually through experience and observation. The Buddha taught that patience is a form of wisdom because it allows the mind to remain calm while life unfolds naturally. When the mind releases the pressure to solve everything instantly, it gains space to observe situations more clearly. This calm observation often leads to better understanding and more thoughtful responses. Letting go of mental burdens also creates room for positive qualities to grow. When the mind is no longer crowded with worry, it becomes more capable of experiencing gratitude, curiosity, and compassion. These qualities naturally flourish when the mind has space. For example, when the mind stops replaying past regrets or future fears, it can appreciate simple experiences more deeply. A quiet moment, a meaningful conversation, or the beauty of nature becomes easier to notice. Life begins to feel richer because attention is no longer consumed by endless mental weight. The Buddha often described the mind as something that can be trained and cultivated. Just as a gardener removes weeds to allow flowers to grow, a person can gradually remove unnecessary worries to allow peace to appear. This process does not happen instantly. The habit of carrying mental burdens may have developed over many years, but each moment of awareness provides an opportunity to set down another stone from the backpack. When a worrying thought appears, a person can pause and ask whether this burden truly needs to be carried. If the thought relates to something that cannot be changed or controlled in the present moment, it may be possible to release it gently. Over time, this practice becomes easier. The mind becomes more skilled at recognizing which thoughts require attention and which ones can be allowed to pass. As this awareness grows, a person begins to experience a profound shift in their relationship with worry. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the constant weight of mental burdens, they move through life with greater lightness. Challenges still arise, and responsibilities still exist, but the mind no longer carries unnecessary fears along with them. Each situation is approached with clarity rather than the heavy pressure of imagined problems. Eventually, the mind discovers that much of the suffering it experienced came from the burdens it chose to carry. When those burdens are set down, even temporarily, the mind becomes free to experience the present moment with calmness and openness. In this way, the path to peace is not always about adding new solutions or controlling every outcome. Sometimes it is simply about putting down the weight that the mind has been carrying for far too long. When the mind stops carrying every burden, life becomes lighter. Each step becomes easier, and in that lightness, a quiet and steady peace begins to grow. 20. The present moment is the only place where peace can live. One of the greatest discoveries a person can make about the mind is realizing that peace is always connected to the present moment. Worry, on the other hand, almost always lives somewhere else. It lives in imagined futures, in predictions about what might go wrong, or in memories about what has already happened. Rarely does worry exist in the simple experience of the present moment. The Buddha often pointed toward this truth because understanding it can completely change the way a person experiences life. Most people spend much of their mental energy traveling through time inside their thoughts. The mind moves backward toward the past, replaying events, mistakes, and memories. Then it jumps forward toward the future, imagining possible problems or trying to predict outcomes. Because the mind is constantly moving through these mental timelines, it rarely rests in the only place where life is actually unfolding, the present moment. When a person becomes aware of this habit, they often realize how little time they truly spend in the present. They may be physically present in a situation, but their thoughts are somewhere else. Someone might be sitting quietly in a room, yet their mind is worrying about something that might happen tomorrow. Another person may be walking through a peaceful place, yet their thoughts are replaying a conversation that happened days ago. The Buddha taught that this constant movement of the mind creates much of the suffering people experience. When the mind leaves the present moment, it enters a world of imagination and memory. In that mental world, problems often appear larger and more threatening than they truly are. Imagine sitting outside on a calm evening while the air is quiet and the surroundings are peaceful. In that moment, nothing dangerous or stressful may be happening. But if the mind begins imagining a difficult conversation that might occur tomorrow, tension immediately appears. The body may feel anxious, and the mind may start planning how to handle the situation. Yet the stress comes entirely from the imagined future rather than from the present moment itself. This example reveals something very important. Worry often creates emotional experiences based on events that have not yet happened. The mind reacts to imagined possibilities as if they are already real. In this way, worry pulls a person away from the calmness that may already exist in the present. The Buddha encouraged people to return their awareness to the present moment because that is where life actually occurs. When attention rests in the present, many worries lose their power because they depend on imagined futures. For example, when a person focuses on their breathing, they bring their attention to something happening right now. The breath moves in and out naturally, anchoring the mind in the present. As attention settles on the breath, the mind gradually releases its grip on distant worries. The same effect can occur when a person pays close attention to simple actions. Walking, eating, listening, or observing nature can become powerful ways of returning to the present moment. When the mind fully experiences what is happening now, it becomes less interested in chasing distant fears. This practice may sound simple, but it has profound effects on the mind. Each moment spent in the present weakens the habit of worrying about the future. Gradually, the mind begins to realize that many of its fears exist only in imagination. Another reason the present moment is so important is that it is the only place where real action can occur. The past cannot be changed because it has already happened. The future cannot be controlled because it has not yet arrived. The present moment is the point where decisions, actions, and understanding can actually take place. When the mind spends too much time worrying about the future, it often forgets that the best preparation for tomorrow happens through wise actions today. By focusing attention on the present moment, a person can respond to life with clarity and intention rather than fear. For example, imagine worrying about an important event that will occur in the future. The mind may imagine many different outcomes and become anxious about what might happen. But the most effective response is often to focus on what can be done now to prepare calmly. By returning attention to the present, the mind becomes more capable of taking meaningful steps instead of becoming trapped in endless thinking. The Buddha also explained that the present moment contains far more richness than the mind usually notices. Because the mind is often distracted by worries, it overlooks many simple experiences that bring quiet joy. The warmth of sunlight, the sound of wind moving through trees, the presence of other people, and the rhythm of breathing are all part of the present moment. When the mind slows down enough to notice these experiences, life begins to feel more alive and meaningful. Worry tends to hide these experiences because it directs attention away from them. The mind becomes so focused on imagined futures that it forgets to experience the life unfolding right now. When awareness returns to the present, the mind discovers a different kind of peace. This peace does not depend on controlling every outcome or solving every future problem. It comes from simply being fully present with the moment that is already here. Another important aspect of the present moment is its simplicity. The future often appears complicated because the mind imagines many possible outcomes, but the present moment is usually much simpler than those imagined futures. Right now, there may be only a few things happening: breathing, sitting, hearing sounds, or noticing sensations in the body. When attention rests in these simple experiences, the mind naturally becomes calmer. This calmness does not mean that life becomes free of challenges. Difficult situations will still arise in the future, but when those moments arrive, they will be experienced in their own present moments. At that time, the mind will have the opportunity to respond with clarity. The Buddha often reminded people that suffering increases when the mind tries to experience the future before it actually arrives. By doing so, the mind creates stress in advance of real events. Returning to the present moment interrupts this pattern. It reminds the mind that the future will unfold when it unfolds, and that worrying about it now rarely improves the situation. Over time, practicing presence becomes a powerful habit. Each time the mind notices itself drifting into worry, it can gently return to the present moment. This return does not require forcing the mind or rejecting thoughts. It simply involves shifting attention back to what is happening now. With repetition, the mind becomes more comfortable resting in the present. Worry still appears occasionally, but it no longer dominates attention as strongly as before. Eventually, a person begins to see that peace was never hidden somewhere in the future. It was always available in the present moment, waiting for the mind to notice it. This realization transforms the relationship with worry. Instead of trying to eliminate every anxious thought, a person learns to return to the present whenever worry appears. In that return, the mind reconnects with the calmness that already exists. The Buddha's teachings remind us that life is not lived in imagined futures or remembered pasts. It unfolds one moment at a time. When the mind learns to rest in those moments, worry gradually loses its influence, and in the quiet space of the present moment, the mind finally discovers the peace it had been searching for all along. 21. Inner silence is the medicine that heals a worried mind. One of the quiet truths that many people overlook is that the mind spends most of its time surrounded by noise. This noise is not always external sounds or the activity of the world around us. Much of it is created internally through constant thinking. Thoughts appear endlessly, one after another, forming an uninterrupted stream of commentary, analysis, planning, remembering, and imagining. For many people, this mental noise has become so familiar that they no longer notice it. Yet this constant movement of thought is one of the main reasons worry continues to dominate the mind. The Buddha often spoke about the importance of stillness and inner silence. He observed that when the mind becomes quiet, it begins to see life more clearly. But when the mind is filled with endless thinking, clarity becomes difficult. Worry thrives in a noisy mind because it hides among the countless thoughts that rush through awareness each day. Imagine standing beside a river during a storm. The water is turbulent, waves crash against the banks, and the current moves rapidly. In such conditions, it becomes difficult to see what lies beneath the surface. But when the storm passes and the water becomes calm, the surface clears and the bottom becomes visible. In the same way, when the mind is constantly moving with thoughts and worries, it becomes difficult to understand what is truly happening inside us. Inner silence is the calm that appears when the mind pauses its endless movement. It is the quiet space where thoughts slow down and awareness becomes steady. In this silence, the mind begins to rest. Worries that once seemed overwhelming begin to lose their intensity because they are no longer surrounded by constant mental activity. Many people believe that silence means the complete absence of thoughts, but that is not entirely accurate. Thoughts may still appear, but they no longer dominate the entire experience of the mind. Instead of reacting immediately to every thought, the mind simply observes them as they pass. The Buddha taught that cultivating inner silence allows a person to experience a deeper level of awareness. When the mind becomes quiet, it becomes easier to notice the subtle patterns that create worry. Instead of being swept away by anxious thoughts, a person can see how those thoughts arise and how they fade. This awareness is powerful because it reveals that worry is not as permanent or solid as it once seemed. In a noisy mind, worrying thoughts repeat endlessly and reinforce each other, but in a quiet mind, those thoughts appear briefly and dissolve more easily. One of the reasons modern life produces so much worry is that people rarely give their minds time to experience silence. Daily life is often filled with constant stimulation. Conversations, technology, social media, news, and entertainment continuously occupy attention. Even when external noise fades, many people immediately turn to another source of distraction. Because of this, the mind rarely experiences moments of stillness. Without stillness, the mind does not have the opportunity to settle. Thoughts continue flowing rapidly, and worry easily becomes part of that flow. The Buddha encouraged people to create moments of quiet reflection each day. This does not require retreating from life or abandoning responsibilities. It simply involves allowing the mind to rest without constant stimulation. For example, sitting quietly for a few minutes while paying attention to breathing can begin to calm the mind. At first, thoughts may continue appearing rapidly, but with patience they gradually slow down. As the mind becomes quieter, a person begins to notice a deeper layer of awareness beneath the surface of thoughts. Walking slowly in nature can also create this quiet space. When attention rests on the rhythm of footsteps, the feeling of air, and the sounds of the environment, the mind begins releasing its grip on worries about the future. In these moments of silence, something remarkable happens. The mind realizes that it does not need to follow every thought that appears. Thoughts continue to arise, but they no longer feel urgent or threatening. Instead, they pass through awareness like clouds drifting across the sky. This experience reveals an important truth. The mind is capable of resting without constant thinking. When this realization becomes clear, worry begins to lose its authority. It becomes just one type of thought among many, rather than the central focus of the mind. Inner silence also strengthens emotional balance. When the mind is noisy and restless, emotions tend to become amplified. A small concern can quickly grow into intense anxiety because the mind keeps repeating the same thought. But in a quiet mind, emotions are experienced more gently. They arise, exist for a moment, and then fade naturally. The Buddha described this state as equanimity, a calm and balanced awareness that remains steady even when circumstances change. Equanimity does not mean suppressing emotions or pretending difficulties do not exist. Instead, it means allowing experiences to appear without immediately reacting with fear or resistance. Inner silence creates the conditions where equanimity can grow. When the mind becomes quiet, it no longer reacts impulsively to every thought or emotion. Instead, it observes them with patience and understanding. Another powerful effect of inner silence is clarity. Many worries appear confusing because the mind tries to solve them while it is still overwhelmed by thoughts. In a noisy mind, different ideas compete for attention, making it difficult to see the situation clearly. But when the mind becomes silent, clarity naturally appears. Solutions that once seemed hidden may suddenly become obvious. Decisions become easier because the mind is no longer clouded by constant thinking. This clarity often surprises people because it reveals that the answers they were searching for through endless worry were already available beneath the noise of their thoughts. The Buddha also taught that inner silence reconnects people with a deeper sense of presence. When the mind stops racing between past and future, it becomes aware of the richness of the present moment. Simple experiences become more vivid. The sensation of breathing, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of birds, and the presence of others become clearer when the mind is quiet. These moments remind us that life itself is unfolding here and now, rather than inside imagined worries. Over time, the mind begins to value silence more deeply. Instead of fearing quiet moments, a person begins seeking them as opportunities for rest and understanding. This does not mean avoiding life's activity or responsibilities. Silence can exist even within a busy life. It is the quiet awareness that remains present beneath the movement of daily events. When inner silence grows stronger, worry loses much of its influence. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer control the mind in the same way. The mind becomes like a wide-open sky where thoughts pass through without disturbing the vastness of awareness. In this spacious awareness, a person begins to feel lighter. The heavy pressure created by constant thinking fades, and the mind experiences a sense of freedom that worry could never provide. The Buddha's teachings remind us that peace does not always come from solving every problem. Sometimes it appears when the mind finally becomes quiet enough to stop creating problems through endless thought. Inner silence is not something distant or difficult to reach. It exists beneath the surface of the mind at every moment. When a person pauses, breathes, and allows the mind to rest, this silence begins to reveal itself. And within that silence lies a deep and steady peace, capable of healing even the most worried mind. 22. Compassion. Toward yourself softens the grip of worry. One of the reasons worry continues to dominate the human mind is because people are often far more critical toward themselves than they realize. The mind not only produces anxious thoughts about the future, but it also judges those thoughts harshly. When worry appears, many individuals immediately blame themselves for feeling anxious. They may think they are weak, incapable, or flawed for experiencing fear about what might happen. This habit of self-judgment quietly strengthens the cycle of worry, because the mind becomes trapped not only in anxiety, but also in criticism of that anxiety. The Buddha taught that compassion is one of the most powerful qualities the mind can develop. While compassion is often discussed in relation to others, the Buddha also emphasized the importance of compassion toward oneself. Without this inner kindness, the mind can become a place of constant pressure and criticism. A worried mind becomes even heavier when it is also burdened by self-judgment. Imagine someone who experiences a difficult situation and begins worrying about the outcome. The mind may start imagining possible problems and negative consequences. This reaction is natural because the mind often tries to protect itself by anticipating danger. However, instead of acknowledging this reaction with patience, many people begin criticizing themselves for it. They might think, "Why am I always like this?" Or, "I should be stronger than this." These thoughts add another layer of tension on top of the original worry. The Buddha observed that suffering increases when the mind reacts to itself with harshness. When worry appears and is immediately followed by self-criticism, the mind becomes trapped in a loop. First, it worries about the future, and then it worries about the fact that it is worrying. This cycle can continue endlessly, creating emotional exhaustion. Compassion breaks this cycle. When compassion appears, the mind responds to its own difficulties with understanding rather than judgment. Instead of criticizing itself for worrying, the mind acknowledges that worry is simply a human reaction to uncertainty. This acknowledgement allows the mind to relax. For example, if a person notices themselves worrying about something in the future, they might gently say to themselves, "It is natural to feel uncertain sometimes. This feeling will pass." This small moment of kindness changes the tone of the inner dialogue. Instead of creating more tension, the mind creates space for calmness. The Buddha often encouraged people to treat themselves with the same kindness they would offer a close friend. Imagine a friend who is worried about an uncertain situation. Most people would not criticize that friend harshly. They would likely offer reassurance, patience, and encouragement. They would remind the friend that it is normal to feel concerned about important events. Yet, many people rarely extend this same understanding to themselves. When worry appears in their own mind, they respond with frustration rather than compassion. The Buddha taught that learning to treat oneself with kindness is essential for inner peace. Compassion does not mean ignoring problems or pretending that worry does not exist. Instead, it creates a supportive environment where the mind can face difficulties without becoming overwhelmed by shame or self-criticism. In this environment, worries lose some of their power because they are no longer surrounded by harsh emotional reactions. Another important aspect of self-compassion is recognizing that every human being experiences uncertainty and fear at times. Worry is not a personal failure, but a common part of the human experience. When a person understands this, they begin to see their worries with greater perspective. Instead of thinking, "Why am I the only one struggling with this?" they realize that countless others have faced similar feelings. This understanding reduces the sense of isolation that often accompanies worry. The Buddha described compassion as a form of healing for the mind. Just as physical wounds require care and patience to heal, emotional struggles require understanding and gentleness. When a person responds to their worries with compassion, the mind gradually becomes more resilient. Resilience does not mean eliminating worry completely. Rather, it means developing the ability to experience worry without becoming overwhelmed by it. A compassionate mind can acknowledge anxious thoughts while remaining calm and balanced. This balance creates an important shift in perspective. Instead of fighting against worry or judging it harshly, the mind begins observing it with curiosity. It notices how worry arises, how it changes, and how it eventually fades. This observation often reveals that worries are not as permanent as they initially appear. Over time, compassion also encourages patience with the process of personal growth. Many people expect themselves to overcome worry quickly, and when progress feels slow, they become discouraged. Compassion reminds the mind that change often happens gradually. Just as a plant requires time to grow, the mind requires time to develop new habits. Each moment of awareness and kindness contributes to that growth. Another powerful effect of compassion is the way it softens emotional tension. Worry often creates tightness in the body and mind. Thoughts become rigid, and the mind feels trapped in a narrow perspective. Compassion loosens this tension by introducing warmth and acceptance. When the mind feels supported rather than attacked, it becomes more willing to release its fears. Worries that once seemed overwhelming begin to lose their intensity because the mind no longer treats them as threats that must be eliminated immediately. Compassion also strengthens emotional connection with others. When a person learns to treat themselves with kindness, they naturally become more understanding toward the struggles of other people. This understanding reduces feelings of isolation and encourages supportive relationships. Supportive relationships provide another source of relief from worry. When people share their concerns with others who listen with empathy, the burden of worry often becomes lighter. Compassion creates the foundation for these meaningful connections. The Buddha often described compassion as a limitless quality of the heart. It can extend outward toward others and inward toward oneself. When compassion flows in both directions, the mind becomes more balanced and peaceful. Practicing self-compassion does not require complex techniques. It can begin with simple awareness. Whenever worry appears, a person can pause and notice how they are responding internally. If harsh self-judgment is present, they can gently replace it with understanding. This small shift gradually transforms the inner environment of the mind. Instead of becoming a place of constant criticism, the mind becomes a space where difficulties are met with patience and care. As this transformation continues, worry loses much of its ability to dominate attention. The mind becomes stronger because it is supported by kindness rather than weakened by judgment. Eventually, a person begins to realize that compassion is not only a response to suffering, but also a path toward freedom. When the mind treats itself with gentleness, it becomes easier to release the fears that once seemed overwhelming. The Buddha's teachings remind us that peace does not come from forcing the mind to be perfect. It comes from understanding the mind's struggles and responding to them with wisdom and kindness. When compassion toward oneself grows stronger, worry begins to soften. The mind feels less pressure, more acceptance, and greater patience with the uncertainties of life. And within that compassionate space, a quiet peace begins to grow, one that allows the mind to move through life's challenges with resilience and calm. 23. Detachment frees the mind from endless worry. One of the deepest reasons people experience constant worry is because the mind becomes strongly attached to outcomes. It wants life to unfold in a very specific way. It wants plans to succeed exactly as imagined, relationships to remain exactly as they are, and circumstances to stay comfortable and predictable. When the mind holds tightly to these expectations, every uncertainty begins to feel threatening. Worry appears because the mind is trying to protect the things it is afraid of losing. The Buddha taught that attachment is one of the main roots of suffering. When the mind clings tightly to how things should be, it becomes fragile whenever life changes. But when the mind learns the wisdom of detachment, a new kind of freedom begins to appear. Detachment does not mean becoming cold, distant, or uncaring. It does not mean abandoning relationships or responsibilities. Instead, detachment means engaging with life without becoming emotionally trapped by outcomes. It means caring about situations while understanding that not everything can be controlled or guaranteed. Many people misunderstand detachment because they believe it requires withdrawing from life. In reality, the Buddha described detachment as a way of participating in life more wisely. When the mind is not constantly clinging to specific outcomes, it becomes calmer, clearer, and more flexible. Imagine holding a delicate object in your hands. If you squeeze it tightly out of fear that it might fall, you may actually damage it. But if you hold it gently and carefully, it remains safe without unnecessary tension. Detachment works in a similar way. When the mind holds life too tightly, it creates stress and fear. When it holds life more gently, peace becomes possible. One of the most common forms of attachment involves expectations about the future. People often imagine how their lives should unfold. They create detailed plans and picture the results they hope to achieve. While planning can be useful, attachment occurs when the mind becomes emotionally dependent on those plans. If life moves in a different direction, the mind reacts with disappointment, frustration, or worry. Instead of adapting to the new circumstances, it continues clinging to the original expectation. This mental struggle creates a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Detachment allows the mind to remain open to the unpredictable nature of life. When expectations exist without rigid attachment, change becomes easier to accept. The mind recognizes that plans may succeed or they may transform into something different. For example, a person might work toward an important goal for many years. If they become completely attached to a specific outcome, any obstacle along the way can trigger intense worry. But when detachment is present, the person continues working toward the goal while accepting that the path may include unexpected turns. This acceptance does not weaken determination. In fact, it often strengthens it. Without the pressure of attachment, the mind can approach challenges with greater clarity and creativity. Another area where attachment creates worry is in relationships. People often become deeply attached to how others should behave or respond. They expect certain words, actions, or emotions from those around them. When these expectations are not met, the mind begins worrying about the relationship. The Buddha encouraged people to understand that every person is influenced by countless conditions, experiences, emotions, and circumstances that may not always be visible. Expecting others to behave exactly as we wish can create unnecessary tension. Detachment in relationships means appreciating others while recognizing that they cannot be completely controlled. It allows love and connection to exist without the constant fear of disappointment. When detachment grows, relationships often become more peaceful. Instead of worrying about every small change in someone's behavior, the mind becomes more patient and understanding. Detachment also transforms the way people view success and failure. Many worries arise from the fear of failing to achieve certain goals. Society often encourages people to define their value based on achievements, status, or recognition. When the mind becomes attached to these external measures of success, it begins worrying constantly about maintaining them. A small setback can feel like a threat to identity itself. The Buddha taught that true peace cannot depend entirely on external achievements, because external conditions are always changing. Detachment allows a person to pursue goals with dedication, while understanding that their worth does not depend solely on outcomes. This perspective creates a deeper sense of stability. Success becomes something to appreciate rather than something that must be protected at all costs. Failure becomes an opportunity to learn rather than a reason for self-criticism. Detachment also helps the mind release the habit of overthinking. When the mind clings to outcomes, it constantly analyzes possibilities in an attempt to guarantee success. It imagines different scenarios and tries to control every detail of the future. But when detachment is present, the mind becomes less obsessed with controlling every possibility. It focuses on taking wise action in the present moment and allows the future to unfold naturally. This shift reduces the mental pressure that often fuels worry. Instead of trying to solve every potential problem in advance, the mind becomes willing to face challenges when they actually appear. The Buddha often used the image of a flowing river to describe the nature of life. A river moves continuously, changing direction and speed as it flows. If someone tries to freeze the river in place, they will only create frustration, but if they learn to move with the river, their journey becomes smoother. Detachment allows the mind to move with the flow of life, rather than resisting it. It recognizes that change is inevitable and that peace arises from flexibility rather than rigid control. Another powerful effect of detachment is the freedom it creates in the mind. When attachment dominates, the mind becomes narrow and tense because it is constantly protecting what it fears losing. But when detachment grows, the mind becomes spacious and open. This spaciousness allows a person to experience life more fully. Moments of joy can be appreciated without the fear that they must last forever. Difficult moments can be faced without the belief that they will never end. Over time, detachment cultivates a deeper form of confidence. This confidence does not come from controlling life perfectly, but from trusting one's ability to adapt to change. When the mind trusts its capacity to respond wisely to whatever arises, worry begins to lose its urgency. Instead of trying to prevent every possible problem, the mind becomes comfortable navigating life step by step. Practicing detachment requires awareness, because the mind has often spent years strengthening attachments. But each moment of observation helps loosen those patterns. Whenever a person notices that their mind is clinging tightly to a specific outcome, they have an opportunity to pause and relax that grip. This pause creates space where acceptance and flexibility can grow. Gradually, the mind begins to experience life with less tension. Goals and relationships remain important, but they are no longer surrounded by constant fear. In this way, detachment becomes one of the most powerful ways to free the mind from endless worry. It allows a person to care deeply about life while remaining calm in the face of uncertainty. The Buddha's teachings remind us that peace does not come from controlling every outcome or guaranteeing every success. It arises when the mind learns to engage with life fully while remaining free from the chains of attachment. When detachment grows, worry fades. The mind becomes lighter, more flexible, and more capable of meeting life with clarity and wisdom. And in that freedom, a deeper and more lasting peace begins to emerge. 24. Understanding impermanence frees the mind from fear. One of the most powerful insights taught by the Buddha is the understanding of impermanence. Impermanence means that everything in life is constantly changing. Nothing remains exactly the same forever. Situations change, emotions change, relationships change, and even the thoughts that fill our minds are continuously shifting. When a person begins to truly understand this truth, many of the worries that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their grip on the mind. Most people live as if things should remain stable and permanent. They expect happiness to last forever and hope that difficult situations will never appear. They imagine that relationships will always stay the same and that the future should unfold according to their expectations. When reality moves in a different direction, the mind reacts with worry and fear. The fear comes from the belief that change is something dangerous that must be prevented. The Buddha observed that this belief is one of the main causes of suffering. When the mind expects permanence from a world that is constantly changing, it creates tension. Every small shift in circumstances becomes a potential source of anxiety. A person might worry about losing success, losing relationships, losing comfort, or losing stability. Yet these worries often arise because the mind is trying to hold on to things that are naturally temporary. Understanding impermanence changes the way a person views life. Instead of expecting everything to remain fixed, the mind begins to recognize that change is a natural part of existence. Just as seasons move from winter to spring and then to summer and autumn, Every experience in life moves through its own cycle of change. When this truth becomes clear, many worries begin to dissolve. If everything is constantly changing, then even difficult situations cannot last forever. A painful moment will eventually pass, just as joyful moments eventually change. This understanding creates a sense of balance in the mind. For example, imagine someone experiencing a challenging period in their life. The mind may become filled with worries about how long the difficulty will last. It may imagine that the problem will continue indefinitely. But when a person remembers the truth of impermanence, they begin to see the situation differently. They understand that this moment, like all moments, will eventually change. This realization does not remove the difficulty completely, but it softens the emotional weight attached to it. Instead of feeling trapped by the situation, the mind becomes more patient. It recognizes that change is already unfolding, even if it is happening slowly. Impermanence also helps reduce worry about the future. Many fears arise because the mind imagines that future events will permanently define life. A person might worry about failing at something important, believing that such a failure would determine their entire future. But when impermanence is understood, the mind realizes that no single event can permanently define life. Even the most difficult experiences eventually transform. People grow, circumstances evolve, and new opportunities appear over time. The mind begins to see that the future cannot be predicted with complete certainty because change is always occurring. This perspective encourages resilience. Instead of fearing every possible mistake or setback, a person becomes more willing to face challenges. They understand that failure, like success, is only a temporary stage in the journey of life. The Buddha also explained that understanding impermanence deepens appreciation for the present moment. When people believe that certain experiences will last forever, they often take them for granted. They assume that relationships, opportunities, and moments of happiness will always be available. But when a person realizes that everything is temporary, they begin to value these experiences more deeply. A simple conversation with a loved one becomes more meaningful when the mind recognizes that such moments cannot be guaranteed forever. A peaceful moment becomes more precious when the mind understands that life is constantly moving. In this way, impermanence does not create sadness. Instead, it encourages gratitude. It reminds the mind to fully experience the present moment rather than postponing appreciation for later. Another important aspect of impermanence is its effect on emotional states. Worry often feels permanent when it appears in the mind. A person may feel trapped by anxiety, believing that it will never fade. But emotions follow the same law of change as everything else. Feelings rise, remain for a time, and then pass away. Even strong emotions eventually weaken when they are observed with patience. Recognizing this truth allows a person to approach their worries with greater calmness. Instead of reacting with panic, the mind can observe the emotion and remind itself that this feeling will also change. Just as a storm eventually clears from the sky, emotional turbulence eventually settles. The Buddha encouraged people to observe their experiences carefully in order to understand impermanence directly. When someone watches their thoughts, they notice how quickly one thought replaces another. When they observe their emotions, they see how feelings shift throughout the day. This direct observation strengthens wisdom because it reveals the true nature of experience. Nothing remains fixed, and every moment flows into the next. Understanding impermanence also helps the mind release attachment. Many worries arise because the mind clings tightly to certain outcomes or experiences. It fears losing them and becomes anxious whenever change appears. But when a person understands that change is inevitable, they begin to loosen their grip. Instead of trying to freeze life in place, they learn to move with its natural rhythm. This movement brings a deeper form of peace, The mind becomes less resistant to change because it understands that change is simply part of life's unfolding. For example, consider how nature reflects impermanence. Trees shed their leaves in autumn, rivers constantly flow, and the sky changes throughout the day. These changes are not signs that something is wrong with nature. They are expressions of its natural order. Human life follows the same pattern. Experiences appear, transform, and fade. When the mind stops resisting this process, it becomes more aligned with the reality of life. The Buddha often described impermanence as a doorway to freedom. When a person truly understands that everything changes, they become less attached to worries about preserving certain outcomes. Instead of trying to control every detail of the future, they focus on responding wisely to each moment as it arises. This approach reduces anxiety because the mind is no longer fighting against the natural movement of life. Over time, the mind develops a deeper sense of trust. It trusts that change will continue to bring new experiences, new opportunities, and new lessons. Even difficult moments become part of a larger process of growth. This trust gradually replaces fear. The mind realizes that uncertainty is not always something to resist. Often, it is simply the space where new possibilities can emerge. The Buddha's teachings remind us that impermanence is not something to fear but something to understand. When a person accepts the truth that everything changes, they become less frightened by life's unpredictability. Worry begins to fade because the mind no longer believes that every change threatens its stability. Instead, it sees change as the natural rhythm of existence. In this understanding, the mind finds freedom. It stops clinging so tightly to the illusion of permanence and begins moving through life with greater openness and peace. And within that openness, worry gradually dissolves, replaced by a calm awareness that every moment, pleasant or difficult, is simply part of the ever-changing flow of life. Throughout life, the mind often becomes trapped in a cycle of worry. It travels into the future, imagining problems that have not happened yet, and it returns to the past, replaying moments that cannot be changed. Because of this constant movement, many people spend their days carrying invisible weight inside their thoughts. Yet the teachings of the Buddha reveal something powerful and liberating. Much of this suffering is not created by life itself, but by the way the mind relates to uncertainty, change, and expectation. When a person begins to understand the nature of worry, everything slowly begins to change. They start to see that many worries are simply stories the mind creates about the future. These stories feel real, but most of them never actually become reality. By observing these thoughts with awareness instead of automatically believing them, the mind begins to loosen its grip on fear. The journey away from constant worry is not about forcing the mind to become perfectly calm. Thoughts will always appear because the mind is active and alive. Instead, the path toward peace involves developing wisdom about how the mind works. Each lesson on this path reveals a different truth. When a person learns to return to the present moment, they discover that peace already exists there. When they accept uncertainty as part of life, the mind stops struggling to control what cannot be controlled. When they understand that thoughts are temporary events rather than permanent truths, worry begins to lose its authority. Patience teaches the mind that not every problem needs to be solved immediately. Compassion softens the harsh judgment people often place upon themselves when worry appears. Detachment frees the mind from the exhausting need to control every outcome, and the understanding of impermanence reminds us that every experience, both joyful and painful, is constantly changing. Through these insights, the mind gradually becomes lighter. The heavy burden of endless worry begins to fall away, not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because the mind learns to move through life with greater wisdom. Challenges will always arise. Uncertainty will always exist. But when the mind becomes calm and aware, it discovers that it has the strength to face these moments without being overwhelmed by fear. The Buddha's teachings guide us toward a simple yet profound realization. Peace is not something hidden far away in the future. It does not appear only when every problem disappears. Peace is available in the present moment, whenever the mind stops chasing worries and begins observing life with clarity. When the mind learns to release unnecessary worry, a new way of living begins to emerge. Life becomes lighter, moments become more meaningful, and the heart becomes more open to the beauty of the present. And in that quiet awareness, a person finally discovers that the freedom they were searching for was never outside of them. It was always waiting within the calm and steady mind that learns to let go.